Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. The wind howls like a wounded beast as I adjust my goggles, squinting through the relentless snow. After 15 years studying glaciers, I thought I'd seen everything these frozen giants had to offer. The cracking sounds beneath my feet are familiar companions, but today they seem different, almost like whispers in an ancient tongue. My research team and I have been tracking unusual thermal readings in this remote section of the Alaskan glacier for weeks, but nothing could have prepared us for what we were about to discover. Sarah's voice crackles through the radio, her excitement barely contained despite the static. "Dr. Marcus, you need to see this immediately." The urgency in her tone makes me abandon my measurements, carefully making my way across the treacherous ice field to her location. The sight that greets me stops me dead in my tracks. A human face, perfectly preserved, stares up at us through layers of crystalline ice. But it's not alone. There are others, dozens perhaps, scattered throughout the glacier like frozen sentinels. The carbon dating results only deepen the mystery. Each body appears to be from a different time period, spanning centuries, yet they all share an unsettling similarity. Their expressions frozen in what appears to be absolute terror. Dr. Chen, our anthropologist, points out unusual markings in the ice surrounding each body. They're not natural formations. They're too precise, too deliberate. "These symbols," she says, her voice trembling slightly, "I've never seen anything like them in any known human civilization." As we set up our equipment to begin the preliminary documentation, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. The glacier seems to pulse with an energy I've never encountered before, and our instruments are picking up impossible readings. The temperature around the bodies is several degrees warmer than the surrounding ice, yet they remain perfectly frozen. It defies everything we know about thermodynamics. The sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the ice field that seem to dance and twist in impossible ways. We need to get our first extraction underway before the impending storm hits. As we prepare the thermal drills, I notice something that sends a chill down my spine. One of the bodies, the first one we discovered, appears to have shifted position slightly. I tell myself it's just a trick of the light, but deep down I know better. The glacier holds secrets far darker than we imagined. The decision to establish base camp near the discovery site proves controversial among the team. Dr. Williams argues passionately against it, citing safety concerns. But I insist, we can't risk losing sight of these specimens, not when they represent such an unprecedented find. As I lay in my tent that night, the wind whipping against the canvas, I hear something that will haunt me forever. A sound like distant singing, emanating from deep within the glacier. When I check my recorder the next morning, the audio file is nothing but static, yet scattered throughout the white noise are fragments of words in a language none of us recognize. When morning arrives, the sense of unease has spread through the entire camp. Our first attempt to extract one of the bodies is met with inexplicable equipment failures. The thermal drill, despite being brand new and thoroughly tested, refuses to penetrate more than a few inches into the ice before shutting down completely. Upon inspection, its internal components appear to have been crystallized. As if the cold had somehow permeated our supposedly weatherproof gear, the radio communications begin to deteriorate next. Random bursts of static interrupt our conversations, and within these bursts, we all swear we can hear voices. Fragments of conversations in languages that sound both ancient and impossibly alien. Sarah, our communications expert, works tirelessly to clean up the recordings, but each attempt only reveals more disturbing layers of sound. Hidden beneath the static are what seem to be screams, though whether of pain or ecstasy, none of us can say for certain. Dr. Chen's behavior becomes increasingly erratic as she studies the symbols surrounding the bodies. I find her one morning, fingers bleeding from frantically etching copies of the markings into her notebook. "They're changing," she insists, showing me her drawings from the previous days. At first, I dismiss her claims, but when I compare our photographic documentation, My blood runs cold. The symbols are indeed different, subtly rearranging themselves like a slow-motion puzzle that no human hand is moving. The first major equipment malfunction occurs during our second extraction attempt. The thermal drill, replaced with our backup unit, suddenly accelerates beyond its safety parameters. The ice around the body we're trying to extract begins to crack. But instead of the normal crystalline fracture patterns I've studied for years, these cracks form perfect geometric shapes that mirror the mysterious symbols. Before we can react, the entire drill assembly implodes, sending dangerous shards of metal flying in all directions. Miraculously, no one is hurt. But the incident leaves us all shaken. That night, the temperature drops to impossible levels, far below what our most pessimistic models predicted. The cold is unlike anything I've experienced in my career. It feels almost alive, probing our shelters for weaknesses, seeking entry. Our heating systems strain against the onslaught, and in the darkness, we hear the ice shifting and groaning around us. But it's not the normal sound of a glacier's movement. These sounds have rhythm, purpose, almost like a heartbeat. The breaking point comes when we discover all our camera equipment has failed simultaneously. Every memory card, every hard drive containing our documentation of the bodies is corrupted. The only images that remain are distorted beyond recognition, showing impossible shadows and shapes moving in the background of each frame. When we return to the excavation site, we make a chilling discovery. The body we had attempted to extract is gone, leaving behind only a perfectly symmetrical hole in the ice, its walls carved with fresh symbols that seem to pulse with a faint, bluish light. I spend hours comparing Dr. Chen's final translations with our remaining photographs, trying to make sense of the impossible. Her notes reveal a terrifying pattern. The symbols form a sort of calendar, not marking time as we understand it, but cycles of awakening, according to her interpretations. We didn't just find preserved bodies. We discovered dormant vessels waiting for the right moment to emerge. The thought makes my hands shake as I document my findings, knowing that sharing this information could destroy my scientific credibility. The disappearance of Dr. Chen haunts our camp like a malevolent spirit. The morning after her breakthrough with the translations, we found her tent empty, her sleeping bag still warm. The only trace of her presence was her notebook, its pages now filled with the same symbols that mark the ice. Written in what appears to be her own blood, most disturbing of all, the writing continues beyond her last coherent entry, as if something else had taken control of her hand, leaving messages we can't begin to comprehend. Our breakthrough comes at a devastating cost, while examining one of the bodies through the ice. Dr. Williams notices something that changes everything. Beneath their frozen skin, there are patterns of movement, like creatures writhing beneath the surface. Using our remaining thermal imaging equipment, we discover that these bodies aren't simply preserved. They're hosting something. The heat signatures show complex networks of energy flowing through them, patterns that resemble no known biological system. The truth about the body's ages shatters our understanding of human history. Carbon dating results from different labs all show the same impossible conclusion. Some of these bodies predate known human civilization by thousands of years, yet their clothing, their features, even their dental work in some cases, appear modernistic. It's as if these people were pulled from different points in time, brought here for some unfathomable purpose by forces we're only beginning to comprehend. Sarah manages to restore one of the corrupted video files, and what we see defies explanation. In the footage, one of the bodies clearly moves, its eyes opening to reveal not darkness but a swirling, iridescent light. More disturbing still, in the background, we can see Dr. Chen standing motionless, her own eyes reflecting the same otherworldly glow. The timestamp shows this occurred hours before her disappearance, during a period when all of us distinctly remember her being in the communications tent with the rest of the team. The revelation hits me like a physical blow when I finally piece it together. The glacier isn't just preserving these bodies, it's transforming them. The ancient inscriptions aren't a warning, they're instructions. A ritual encoded in ice, describing the metamorphosis of human flesh into something else entirely. And according to the calendar we've decoded, We arrived just in time to witness the completion of a cycle that's been building for millennia. The ice around us isn't just shifting anymore, it's awakening. And we're trapped here with whatever is emerging from its frozen depths. The storm descends with unnatural fury, transforming our world into a howling void of white. Our satellite communications fail completely, leaving us cut off from the outside world. But it's not the isolation that terrifies us. It's the knowledge that we're not truly alone. Through the walls of ice surrounding our camp, we can see them now. Bodies moving through the glacier like sharks through dark water. Their forms distorted but unmistakably active. The second disappearance hits us harder than the first. James, our senior technician, ventures just 20 feet from the main shelter to check our backup generator. The storm parts for a brief moment, and in that instant, we all witness it. A hand of crystalline ice emerging from the ground, pulling him down with impossible strength. His screams echo through our radios for hours afterward, growing more distorted until they no longer sound human when we play back the recordings. We hear other voices responding to his cries in that same ancient language we've been hearing in the static. Our remaining equipment begins to show readings that defy physics. Temperature sensors detect pockets of absolute zero moving through the ice like air bubbles, while radiation detectors spike off the charts at random intervals. Most disturbing are the seismic readings, which show patterns identical to human heartbeats, but on a massive scale. As if the entire glacier is alive and breathing, the ice itself seems to pulse with a bioluminescent glow that intensifies with each passing hour. Sarah's theory about what we're witnessing shakes me to my core. She believes the glacier is acting as some kind of temporal anchor point, a place where the barriers between different times and possibly different dimensions have worn thin. The bodies we found aren't victims, they're pioneers, deliberately placed here throughout history by something that's been orchestrating this moment for thousands of years. The storm isn't trapping us here, it's part of the process, accelerating whatever transformation is taking place. The truth about Dr. Chen's disappearance becomes clear when we spot her through the ice, moving among the other bodies. Her form is both familiar and hideously wrong, her flesh now translucent and threaded with channels of flowing light. She presses her hands against the ice walls of our shelter, leaving behind new symbols that burn themselves into the frozen surface. Through the distortion, I can see her trying to speak, her mouth forming words that make my ears bleed when we hear them through the radio static in our final hours of what we might call normality. We make a discovery that explains everything and nothing. Deep radar scans reveal a massive chamber beneath the glacier, its walls lined with thousands more bodies in various stages of transformation. At its center lies something our instruments can't properly analyze, a structure that seems to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. As we study the readings, the storm reaches its peak, and the ice beneath our feet begins to crack open like a hatching egg. The glacier is not just awakening, it's opening itself to something that's been waiting for eons to emerge. The truth reveals itself in fragments of horror and enlightenment as the glacier tears itself apart around us. The chamber beneath us isn't just a room, it's an ancient gateway, and we've become unwitting participants in its activation. Through the crystalline walls, I watch as the transformed bodies of my former colleagues move in perfect synchronization, their movements forming patterns that mirror the symbols we've been studying. They're not just dancing, they're completing a ritual that began millennia ago. Sarah's final transmission comes through our radios with terrifying clarity, her voice overlapping with others from different times and places. "We were never meant to study them," she says, her words distorting into something less human with each syllable. "We were meant to join them, the ice. It's not preserving us, it's preparing us." The signal dissolves into that ancient language we've been hearing. But now, to my horror, I understand every word. The knowledge floods my mind like glacial meltwater, carrying with it visions of what lies beyond the threshold of our reality. The entity reveals itself not as a single being, but as a collective consciousness that has been seeding itself throughout human history. Each preserved body we found was a carefully placed anchor, a human vessel deliberately transformed to help bridge the gap between our world and theirs. The symbols weren't warnings or even instructions. They were a countdown, marking the moments until the barriers between dimensions grew thin enough for the full emergence to begin. As this realization hits me, the chamber beneath us pulses with a light that seems to bend space itself. In what feels like both an instant and an eternity, I witness the true nature of our discovery. The ice crystallizes around me, not to trap or preserve, but to transform. Through my changing flesh, I see the others who came before, explorers, scientists, indigenous peoples, all now part of this vast, eternal consciousness. Dr. Chen appears before me, her form now a perfect fusion of human and crystalline architecture, extending her hand in both welcome and warning. Through her, I understand that humanity has never been alone. We've been guided, shaped, and prepared for this moment since our first steps out of the African cradle. The transformation sweeps through me like a tide of liquid nitrogen, each cell of my body becoming something that exists in multiple states simultaneously. The pain is excruciating yet transcendent as my consciousness expands to encompass perspectives from across time and space. I see now that the glacier was never just a natural formation. It's a chrysalis, a transformation chamber designed eons ago by beings who exist outside our understanding of reality. And as my humanity dissolves into this greater awareness, I realize that every scientific expedition, every mysterious disappearance throughout history, was orchestrated to create a critical mass of transformed beings. In my final moments of individual consciousness, I understand the full scope of what we've uncovered. The ancient entities didn't choose this remote location to hide. They chose it to incubate as the gateway fully activates, tearing open the veil between dimensions. I realize we're not just witnesses to this emergence, we're part of it. The storm above intensifies, not of natural causes, but as a result of reality itself, buckling under the pressure of what's awakening. The sound of my boots echoing against the ancient rock walls has become a familiar companion over the past 15 years of cave exploration. But today, as our team stands before an unmapped crevice in the Grand Canyon's northern rim, something feels different. The air whispering from the narrow opening carries an unsettling chill that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Dr. Sarah Chen, our lead geologist, runs her weathered hands along the smooth edges of the entrance, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. The discovery of this cave system wasn't in any of our plans. We were conducting a routine geological survey when Maria, our youngest team member, noticed an unusual rock formation that seemed to pulse with its own gravitational pull. As we cleared away centuries of debris, we uncovered what appeared to be deliberately carved steps descending into darkness. James, our equipment specialist, insisted on running preliminary safety checks, but even our most sensitive instruments struggled to get reliable readings of the cave's depth. As we begin our descent, the beam from my headlamp catches something that makes my heart skip a beat. Perfectly preserved handprints of what appear to be children, stamped in red ochre along the wall. The most disturbing aspect isn't their presence, but rather their orientation. They're facing downward, as if their owners were being dragged into the depths. Sarah immediately starts documenting them, but I notice her hands trembling as she photographs each print. The first sign that we've stumbled onto something extraordinary comes 3 hours into our descent. The narrow passage suddenly opens into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. Our voices echo strangely here, coming back to us distorted and changed, as if someone else is answering. The rock walls are covered in symbols. Unlike any native rock art I've ever encountered in my career, they seem to shift and change when viewed from different angles, forming what looks like faces in perpetual agony. That's when we hear it. A sound that has no place this deep underground. A child's laughter, clear as day, echoing through the chamber. Maria drops her sample collection kit, the sound of shattering glass piercing the silence. We all freeze, waiting for the echo to fade. But it doesn't. Instead, it's joined by what sounds like whispered conversations in a language that makes my skin crawl. Dr. Chen swears it sounds like Proto-Indo-European. but that language hasn't been spoken in over 5,000 years. The day's final discovery comes as we're setting up base camp in the main chamber. James, while securing anchor points for our equipment, uncovers what appears to be a stone door set into the far wall. Its surface is covered in spiraling patterns that seem to move in the beam of our lights. More disturbing are the deep grooves at its base, as if countless hands have tried to claw their way out from the other side. As we settle in for the night, none of us can shake the feeling that something ancient and malevolent has been waiting for us to find this place. The whispers continue, growing louder as darkness falls, and I swear I can hear my name being called from behind that door. Sleep proves impossible as the whispers grow more insistent through the night. By morning, we're all exhausted, but what we discover in the first light of our lamps makes us forget our fatigue. The walls that seemed merely decorated yesterday now reveal their true nature. They're covered in massive murals that tell a story none of us are prepared to accept. The paintings show hooded figures leading lines of children into a great maw in the earth, while above them, creatures with too many limbs watch from cloud-like formations. Dr. Chen's face grows increasingly pale as she translates more of the symbols. According to her preliminary analysis, these caves were once used by a civilization that predates any known human settlement in North America. The writings speak of those who dwell between worlds and the Great Feeding, terms that appear repeatedly alongside images of ritualistic ceremonies. What's most disturbing is how the children are depicted. Their eyes are always painted as solid black voids, and their hands reach upward toward the many-limbed beings. Maria's scream echoes through the chamber around midday. We find her in a small alcove, trembling and pointing at what appears to be a perfectly preserved child's doll made of bone and sinew. The craftsmanship is impossibly delicate, but carbon dating would later reveal its age to be over 10,000 years old. As James reaches to collect it for analysis, I swear I see its head turn slightly to follow his movement. Before he can touch it, a gust of wind, impossible at this depth, extinguishes all our lights simultaneously. When we restore power, James is gone. The search for James leads us deeper into the cave system. Following the sound of his voice calling for help, the passages here are different. The walls are smooth, almost polished, and warm to the touch. We find his helmet next to another door, similar to the first, but covered in different symbols. These ones seem to writhe and squirm under our flashlight beams, and I could swear I hear them whispering in a language that makes my teeth ache. Dr. Chen insists we document everything before proceeding, but her scientific detachment is cracking. I catch her crossing herself when she thinks no one is looking. It's Maria who makes the connection that changes everything. The children's handprints we saw earlier aren't random. They form a pattern that matches constellations, but not any we know. They map stars from over 10,000 years ago, stars that Dr. Chen says would have aligned directly over this location during the spring equinox. As she explains this, the whispering suddenly stops, replaced by what sounds like hundreds of children singing in perfect, terrible harmony. The song seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and contains words that make my nose bleed when I try to understand them. We find James's body at sunset, according to our watches, though time feels meaningless down here now. He's sitting cross-legged before a vast wall of symbols, his headlamp still illuminating the horror they depict. His eyes are open and completely black, like the children in the murals, and his face is frozen in an expression of absolute terror. But it's what's carved into his chest that breaks us, a perfect replica of the star pattern from the handprints. Still bleeding despite the absolute impossibility of this fact, as we rush to help him, his head turns completely around, and he speaks in a child's voice. They're ready to play again. After James's impossible death, the rational part of my mind begins to crumble. We can't reach the surface for help. Our radio signals are met with only the sound of children humming that same terrible melody. The singing grows louder as we follow a new passage that opens beneath the spot where we found James. Sarah's archaeological instincts are at war with her survival instincts, but we all know we're past the point of turning back. The passage descends at an impossible angle, yet we walk normally, as if gravity itself has lost meaning. The chamber we discover defies everything we know about cave formation. Perfect spherical bubbles of various sizes are carved into the walls, each containing small bundles wrapped in ancient cloth. Dr. Chen approaches one, her scientific curiosity momentarily overwhelming her fear as she unwraps the first bundle. The singing stops abruptly. Inside, we find a child's skull, its eye sockets filled with black crystals that seem to pulse with their own inner light. Maria counts the bubbles. There are exactly 333 of them. The implications of what we're seeing send cold shivers down my spine. The true horror reveals itself when Sarah translates the text surrounding each bubble. These weren't just sacrifices, they were vessels. The ancient civilization believed that children's souls could bridge the gap between our world and something they called the space between stars. Each skull was meant to act as a doorway, and the crystals were described as eyes that see beyond. As she reads this aloud, every crystal in every skull suddenly turns to track our movements. The singing returns. But now we can understand the words, though we desperately wish we couldn't. Maria is the first to notice that the chamber is changing. The bubbles are slowly contracting, pushing the skulls outward, and a fine black powder begins to fall from above. When it touches our skin, we hear voices, children's voices, whispering their names, their fears, and the truth about why they were brought here. Each grain of powder contains a memory of terror, and they're falling faster now. Sarah screams that according to the texts, this is how it began the first time, when the stars were right and the space between worlds grew thin. The revelation about our true purpose here hits me like a physical blow. We weren't the ones who discovered this cave. We were led here. The ancient writings speak of a cycle, a need for new vessels every 10,000 years. The children in the walls were never the sacrifice. They were the bait. Adult souls, corrupted by time and experience, are what the entities truly crave. A child's laughter echoes through the chamber as this realization dawns. And Maria points to our shadows on the wall. There are now small figures holding our hands. Though we stand alone, the black crystals begin to vibrate in unison, and the children's singing reaches a fever pitch. Sarah translates the final lines of text just as the chamber's entrance seals itself. The vessels prepare the way, the flesh remembers, the stars align. Then, Maria begins to speak in multiple voices, her eyes turning to black crystal, and we learn the true meaning of terror. She tells us why the ancient ones chose this place, why it had to be children first, and what's been growing in the space between worlds all these millennia. As her skin begins to crack, revealing a dark light within, we realize we're not here as explorers or victims. We're here as parents. Sarah is gone. After Maria's transformation, she ran deeper into the caves, clutching her notebook and screaming about mathematical patterns in the children's song. I can still hear her voice echoing back to us occasionally, but it's changing, becoming younger with each reverberation. Only I remain untouched, watching helplessly as Maria's form continues to shift and crack, revealing glimpses of impossible geometries beneath her skin. The black powder has formed a thick carpet beneath our feet, each step releasing whispered fragments of ancient memories. The chamber has become a living thing, pulsing with a dark light that seeps from between the stones. The skull-filled bubbles are now fully extended from the walls, and I swear I can see small hands pressing against their crystalline surfaces from within. The ancient text that covers every surface has begun to move, forming new patterns that Maria, or what used to be Maria, reads aloud in voices that were never meant to emerge from a human throat. Each word makes the space between worlds grow thinner, and through the cracks I catch glimpses of what waits beyond. Through the crystalline eyes of the transformed Maria, I'm forced to witness the truth about the Grand Canyon's formation. It wasn't water that carved these mighty cliffs, but something far older, something that burrowed down from above when the stars were young. The ancient civilization didn't build these chambers. They discovered them just as we did. The cave system is a vast cocoon, and we are witnessing the final stages of its incubation. Each child's soul in these walls was a tiny piece of a key, and we just helped turn the final lock. Sarah's voice reaches us again, but now it's singing with the choir of the damned. I follow the sound, leaving Maria behind as her transformation nears completion. The passage leads me to a vast precipice, and far below, I see Sarah standing before a mirror-smooth wall of black stone. Her shape is distorted, elongated, and surrounded by small dancing shadows that were once human children. She turns to look up at me, and her face has become a window into that other place. The space between stars where these entities have waited for so long, the revelation hits me as the ground begins to tremble. The ancient civilization's ritualistic sacrifices weren't meant to appease these entities. They were meant to imprison them. Each child's soul was a link in a chain that held something unimaginable at bay. By discovering this place, by breaking the seals and translating the texts, we've begun the process of their release. The black crystals weren't doorways for the children's souls to escape. They were locks to keep something else contained. Now that containment is failing, as the cavern walls crack and peel away like dead skin. I understand our true role in this cosmic horror. We weren't chosen randomly. Each of us had a specific genetic marker, passed down through generations from that ancient civilization. We were created to be keys, shaped by 10,000 years of careful breeding. The children in the walls recognize us as their descendants, and their songs are not warnings but expressions of joy. Through us, they can finally complete the task they began millennia ago. As the last pieces fall into place, I realize with growing horror that what we thought was an awakening was actually a homecoming. The black stone wall before Sarah begins to melt, revealing what our ancestors sought to contain eons ago. The space between stars isn't a metaphor. It's a literal description of the void that exists in the folds of our reality. Through Sarah's crystalline face, I see them. Vast, geometric entities that exist in dimensions our minds cannot fully comprehend. They've been waiting here, dreaming in the darkness, using the children's souls as anchors to maintain their connection to our world. Each laugh, each song was a ripple of their influence reaching through time. The truth about my own existence crashes down upon me as Maria's transformed body slithers into the chamber. We weren't just descendants of the ancient civilization. We were their final failsafe. The genetic markers in our blood weren't meant to make us keys, but rather living locks. The children's souls weren't sacrifices or bait. They were guardians, waiting for the right combination of bloodlines to return. As Maria and Sarah begin to circle me, their forms now barely recognizable as human, I understand that my presence here completes a ritual 10,000 years in the making. The entities emerge fully now, their geometries hurting my eyes as they fold through dimensions I was never meant to perceive. They reach for me with appendages made of living darkness, but something unexpected happens. The children's skulls in the chamber above begin to resonate with a new frequency, and the black crystals illuminate with a light that seems to strip away the veils of reality. In my mind, I hear the voices of countless generations speaking in unison, revealing the final truth. The ancient civilization didn't fail in their containment ritual. This was their plan all along. My blood carries not just the genetic legacy of the ancients, but the culmination of their greatest work. As the entities touch me, trying to pull me into their impossible geometries, my body begins to change, not like Maria or Sarah, who were mere catalysts, but into something the ancient ones designed across 10 millennia of careful breeding. The children's songs rise to a crescendo that shatters the remaining barriers between worlds, but instead of opening our reality to theirs, my transformed being begins to draw them in, becoming a living prison of flesh and consciousness. The agony is indescribable as my form expands to encompass dimensions that no human was meant to contain. Maria and Sarah, their bodies now completely transformed, become extensions of my new existence, their crystalline forms serving as anchors in our reality. The entities howl in frequencies that rupture the fabric of space-time, realizing too late that they haven't been awakening. They've been drawn into an inescapable trap. The children's souls, finally freed from their long vigil, begin to fade, their last laughs echoing with triumph rather than terror. In these final moments of my humanity, I understand the full scope of what we've accomplished. The Grand Canyon itself is transformed, its vast network of caves collapsing into a singularity of consciousness within my new form. I'm no longer human, but a living lock crafted across thousands of generations. The entities are sealed within me, and I within the rock, becoming a guardian far more powerful than the children's souls ever were. As my awareness expands across eons, I feel others like me awakening around the world, other sites, other caves, other carefully crafted bloodlines completing their own transformations. We are the final generation of an ancient plan, living barriers between dimensions, eternal watchers in the spaces between stars. The children's laughter fades to silence, their duty done, as I settle into my eternal vigil, knowing that humanity will never know how close they came to witnessing what lies beyond the thin veil of reality. I've been climbing for over 20 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed that day in Zion. The morning started like any other reconnaissance mission: gear check, weather assessment, and route planning. As an investigator for the National Park Service, I'd heard my share of bizarre stories, but the recent reports about moving reflections in the rock faces had caught my attention in a way that other cases hadn't. The autumn air was crisp and heavy with moisture, unusual for Utah's typically arid climate. Thick clouds hung low over the towering sandstone cliffs, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to compress the very space around me. I'd chosen to start my investigation at Angel's Landing, where 3 separate groups had reported seeing the inexplicable reflections within the past month. The witnesses' descriptions were remarkably consistent: human-shaped figures that appeared to mirror their movements even on overcast days when reflection should have been impossible. As I made my way up the narrow trail, the familiar burn in my muscles provided a comforting rhythm to counter my growing unease. The chains that usually guided climbers along the more precarious sections felt unusually cold beneath my gloved hands. I'd climbed this route countless times, but today, something felt different. The rock itself seemed to pulse with an energy I'd never noticed before, like a heartbeat trapped within the ancient stone. I reached Scout Lookout just as a gap in the clouds allowed a brief shaft of sunlight to pierce through, illuminating the sheer cliff face before me. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned sharply, my heart racing, but the rock wall showed only its familiar weathered surface. I forced myself to breathe steadily, reminding myself that I was here to investigate, not to jump at shadows. But as I lifted my camera to document the area, I froze in the viewfinder. A distinct human silhouette stood where moments ago there had been only stone. The figure wasn't simply a trick of light and shadow. It moved with a fluid grace that defied natural explanation. As I lowered my camera with trembling hands, the apparition remained visible to my naked eye, its form becoming more distinct with each passing second. What disturbed me most wasn't its presence, but the way it seemed to study me with an intelligence that radiated ancient wisdom and malevolent curiosity. When I shifted my weight, it mirrored my movement precisely, like a dark reflection in a pool of still water. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Through the static, I could barely make out the voice of my colleague at the ranger station. Reports of unusual activity. Climb down immediately. The message cut off abruptly, but I barely noticed. My attention was fixed on the wall of rock before me, where the single figure had been joined by others, dozens of them, each one emerging from the stone like photographs developing in reverse. And every single one of them was looking directly at me. The descent from Angel's Landing was a blur of frantic movements and racing thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figures were following me, their presence lingering just beyond my field of vision by the time I reached the ranger station. My clothes were soaked with sweat despite the cool air. Park Ranger Sarah Chen, my longtime colleague, took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. Her expression told me she had seen something too. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out a dusty file from the station's archives. "You need to see this," she whispered, spreading photographs across her desk. They were expedition documents from 1923, yellowed with age but still clear enough to send chills down my spine. The images showed a group of climbers scaling the same walls I had just fled from, and in the background, Unmistakable human silhouettes emerged from the rock face. The final photo in the series showed only empty climbing gear scattered across a ledge. The entire team had vanished without a trace. The historical records revealed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Every 27 years, there was a spike in disappearances around Zion's climbing routes. The local Paiute tribes had warned the first European settlers about the dangers of climbing certain walls. Speaking of ancient spirits that guarded sacred passages between worlds, most historians had dismissed these stories as superstition, but sitting in that cramped office with the evidence mounting before me, I couldn't maintain my skepticism any longer. As Sarah and I dug deeper into the archives, we discovered a journal belonging to one of the missing climbers from 1923. The final entry described how the reflections had begun communicating through mimicry, gradually leading the team higher and higher up the canyon walls. The writer mentioned a cave that shouldn't have existed, one that appeared only when the figures guided them to it. The last words scrawled across the page read, "They're not reflections at all, they're coming through." A loud bang against the station's window made us both jump. Outside, the sun had set, plunging the canyon into deep shadow, but even in the growing darkness we could see them, dozens of silhouettes pressed against the glass, their forms more solid than before. They moved in perfect unison, performing a mesmerizing dance that made my head spin. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Look at their faces," she gasped. I stared harder, and my blood ran cold. Among the crowd of figures, I recognized the features of the missing 1923 expedition team. The lights in the station flickered and died, leaving us in total darkness except for the faint luminescence emanating from the figures outside. In the silence that followed, we heard it, a rhythmic tapping against the windows that slowly resolved into a pattern. Sarah, who knew Morse code, began translating with shaking voice. "Find THEGATE," the message repeated, growing more insistent with each cycle. And beneath the tapping, I could hear something else. The sound of stone grinding against stone, as if the very mountains were opening up to reveal their secrets. The discovery of the Paiute manuscripts changed everything. After that night at the ranger station, Sarah and I spent days translating the brittle documents that had been stored in the park's historical collection. The ancient texts spoke of a time when the barrier between worlds was thinner, when the rock faces of Zion served as doorways between our reality and what they called the Shadow Realm. The native people had learned to seal these gateways, but they warned that every 27 years, when specific stars aligned, the barriers would weaken. The deeper we delved into the translations, the more unsettling the implications became. The reflections weren't merely spirits or ghosts. They were what remained of every person who had ever been taken. The Shadow Realm existed as a dark mirror of our world, where time moved differently and consciousness persisted in a twisted form. According to the manuscripts, those trapped there didn't age or die. They simply existed, watching our world through the thin veil of rock, desperately seeking new companions to join their eternal vigil. I found myself drawn back to the climbing routes. Despite Sarah's protests, the figures appeared more frequently now, their movements more deliberate and coordinated. They seemed to be trying to show me something, leading me along specific paths I'd never noticed before, using the patterns described in the Paiute texts. I began to map their appearances. A clear design emerged. They were tracing the outline of an ancient petroglyph that had been weathered away centuries ago. The revelation hit me like a physical blow when I aligned our modern maps with the Paiute drawings. The disappearances hadn't been random at all. They formed a perfect spiral pattern across the park. Converging on a single point, the next target area would be Echo Canyon, and according to both the historical pattern and astronomical calculations, the next event would occur in less than 48 hours. Even more disturbing was the realization that the number of figures I could see had been steadily increasing. As if they were gathering for something, Sarah's research into the park's missing persons database revealed another chilling detail. Each previous cycle had claimed exactly 7 victims, no more, no less. The Paiute texts referred to this as the sacred count, though they didn't explain its significance. But this time something was different. The reflections were appearing more frequently and in greater numbers than ever recorded. It was as if the barrier between worlds was deteriorating faster than the normal cycle should allow. The final piece fell into place when we discovered a hidden chamber beneath the ranger station. Sealed behind a wall that bore the same symbols we'd found in the Paiute documents, inside, preserved in a cedar box, we found a set of ceremonial tools and a map unlike any I'd ever seen. It didn't show the physical layout of Zion, but rather what appeared to be a network of energy lines converging on the canyon. According to the accompanying notes, these lines had been used by ancient shamans to navigate between worlds, but a hastily scrawled warning on the map's edge made my heart stop. When 7 becomes 7 times 7, the gate will open forever. I should have known better than to return to Echo Canyon alone, but the pull was irresistible. The setting sun cast long shadows across the canyon walls, and in the fading light, the boundary between stone and spirit seemed to blur. The figures had been growing more substantial throughout the day, no longer content to merely mimic. They were leading now. Beckoning with increasing urgency, the temperature had dropped dramatically, and my breath came out in visible puffs that seemed to linger too long in the air. The ancient tools we'd found felt heavy in my backpack. A worn ceremonial dagger, crystals embedded with strange symbols, and the map that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The Paiute texts had been clear. These items were meant to seal the gateway, not open it, but as I watched the shadows dance across the rock face, I realized with growing horror that I wasn't there to close anything. Some deep, primal part of me needed to understand what lay beyond, needed to see what had happened to all those lost souls over the centuries. The first physical contact happened as I reached the convergence point marked on the map. A cold hand, solid yet somehow still translucent, gripped my shoulder. I spun around to face what appeared to be a young woman in ancient climbing gear, one of the victims from 1923. Her eyes held no malice, only an infinite sadness and longing that made my chest ache. Behind her, other figures emerged from the stone, each from a different era, but all bearing the same expression of desperate hope. They surrounded me in a perfect circle, their forms now completely solid in the deepening twilight. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The map in my hands began to glow with an inner light, its lines pulsing in sync with an otherworldly rhythm that seemed to emanate from the very rocks themselves. The figures began to move in a synchronized pattern, and I realized with sudden clarity that they were performing the ritual described in the warning texts, not to seal the gateway, but to tear it wide open. What happened next defied all natural laws. The rock face before me rippled like water, and through the undulating stone, I caught glimpses of another world, a twisted mirror version of Zion where the colors were wrong and the angles seemed to bend in impossible ways. The trapped souls had begun to chant in an ancient language, their voices resonating with the strange harmonics of their prison realm. In that moment, I understood their true purpose. They hadn't been trying to warn others away. They had been gathering witnesses, collecting souls, building power for this very moment. The ceremonial dagger pulsed with an answering energy, and I felt my feet moving forward against my will. The woman from 1923 stretched out her hand, her smile both welcoming and terrible. Through the rippling portal, I could see thousands of figures stretching into the distance, all the lost souls of centuries waiting in that dark reflection of our world. And in the center of their vast gathering, something ancient and massive was stirring, something that had been waiting for this moment since the first gateway was sealed. The true architect of all these disappearances was about to be revealed, and I was powerless to stop what was coming. The ancient entity revealed itself as the stone portal fully materialized, a vast, shapeless mass of writhing shadows and reflected memories, countless faces morphing and merging within its dark expanse. This was the Collector, the being that had manipulated humanity's fascination with their own reflection since the dawn of time. Every disappearance, every lost soul had been feeding its power, preparing for this moment of complete convergence between worlds. Sarah's voice cut through the otherworldly chorus. shocking me back to reality. She had followed me, carrying the original Paiute ceremonial texts. As the collector reached out with tendrils of liquid shadow, she began to read the ancient words, not the corrupted version that had been preserved in the ranger station, but the true sealing ritual passed down through her own ancestral line. Her grandmother had been Paiute, a detail she'd never thought relevant until now. The trapped souls recoiled, their chanting faltering as the true words of power pierced their eternal twilight. The woman from 1923 grabbed my arm, her touch burning cold, her eyes pleading. "We only wanted to go home," she whispered, her form flickering between solid and shadow. "It promised us a way back, showed us our families still waiting, still searching. We didn't know we were making it stronger." The other figures began to fade, their carefully choreographed ritual disrupted by Sarah's intervention. But the collector was too powerful now, reaching through the weakened barrier with centuries of accumulated power. In that moment of clarity, I understood what had to be done. The ceremonial dagger wasn't meant to seal the gateway. It was a key, meant to lock the door from both sides. The collector had twisted this truth, using our own reflections to lure us into opening the way. But the blade could still serve its true purpose. Looking at Sarah, I saw in her eyes that she understood too. Her voice grew stronger, the ancient words building to a crescendo as I raised the dagger. The trapped souls surged forward, no longer under the collector's control. Adding their own voices to the sealing ritual, reality fractured around us as I plunged the blade into the heart of the portal. The gateway began to collapse, but instead of sealing shut, it started pulling everything back. All the stolen souls, all the accumulated power, and the collector itself. The woman from 1923 smiled, truly smiled, as her form dissolved into light. One by one, the lost souls were freed. Returning to whatever lay beyond mortal existence, the collector fought against the collapse, its vast form trying to maintain its grip on both worlds. But the combined power of the ritual and the sacrificial key was too strong. As the gateway imploded, time seemed to twist in on itself. I caught glimpses of every disappearance being undone, lives restored to their proper paths, families reunited without ever knowing they had been separated. Sarah's voice spoke the final words of the ritual as I felt myself being pulled into the collapsing portal. In that last moment, I understood that someone had to ensure the gateway was sealed from the other side. Permanently this time. The knowledge felt right, felt like a choice rather than a sacrifice. The last thing I saw was Sarah's knowing look, a mix of sadness and pride as the world of reflections claimed its final guardian. Today, the climbers of Zion see only their natural shadows on the canyon walls. The records show no mysterious disappearances, no 27-year cycle of loss. Sometimes, though, on particularly clear days, they might catch a glimpse of something in the rock face. Not a reflection, but a subtle watchfulness. A protective presence ensuring that the barriers between worlds remain strong. And in the ranger station, in a drawer that's never opened, there's a final photograph showing a lone figure standing guard in a world of twilight, keeping eternal vigil against the darkness that lurks behind every reflection. The piercing sound of the rescue alarm jolts me awake at 3 a.m., another emergency in Denali National Park. My 6th this month as team leader of the Special Rescue Unit. I've seen my share of strange occurrences in these mountains, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited us. Sarah, our meteorologist. Report severe weather moving in. We need to move fast. I briefed my team in the helicopter, Mike, our medical expert with 15 years of experience, Chen, our survival specialist who knows these mountains better than anyone, Sarah, who's never wrong about the weather, and Tom, our newest member, eager but green. The coordinates lead us to a remote area that hasn't seen human activity in decades. The pilot's face grows pale as we approach. Something's wrong with the instruments. The first structure appears through the morning mist like a nightmare made real. I've seen improvised shelters before, but this is different. Bones, hundreds of them, meticulously arranged into a dome-like shelter, human bones. The structure stands about 8 feet tall, bleached white against the dark forest backdrop. My team stays silent, processing what we're seeing. The radio crackles with static as we land. Our mission is to find 3 missing hikers last seen 5 days ago in this area. The bone shelter might be our first clue, but something feels terribly wrong. The air is thick with an unnatural stillness, and the usual mountain wildlife is conspicuously absent. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. Tom starts documenting the structure while Chen examines the construction. "These bones," he mutters, "they're old, really old, but look at how they're joined. It's impossible." He's right. The bones are interconnected without any visible means of support, defying gravity and engineering principles. As he touches one, a low vibration runs through the entire structure. We decide to dismantle it carefully. We need to check if the missing hikers might be inside or if there are any clues to their whereabouts. As we remove the first bone, a sound like distant whispers fills the air before our eyes. The bone slips from Chen's grasp, floating back to its original position. We stand frozen, watching as the structure reassembles itself, each bone finding its place with horrible precision. That's when we hear the screaming from deeper in the woods, back at base camp. The weight of what we've witnessed hangs heavy in the air. The screams led us nowhere. Just endless circles in the dense forest. Sarah digs through the park's historical records while I coordinate with local authorities. The satellite phone keeps cutting out, leaving us increasingly isolated as the storm builds overhead. Tom discovers an old journal in the park archives. Dated 1924, a similar incident. 3 hunting parties vanished in the same region. The journal describes identical structures. Impossible architecture of bone and sinew that refused to stay dismantled. The writer, a park ranger named James Sullivan, disappeared while investigating. His last entry mentions ancient Native Alaskan warnings about a hunger that sleeps in cycles. Chen's research reveals a pattern. Every 100 years, precise to the month, people vanish in these mountains. The local Athabascan tribes avoided this region, calling it the place where bones walk. Their legends speak of a being that harvests souls, building monuments from the remains of its victims. The structures aren't just shelters, they're markers. Territory claims of something ancient and patient. The historical photographs send chills down my spine. The bone structures in 1924 are identical to what we found today, down to the last detail. But it's what's in the background that disturbs me most. A shadowy figure, barely visible, impossibly tall and thin. I checked the metadata. The photo was taken moments before Sullivan disappeared. Sarah's weather models show something unprecedented. The storm isn't natural. It's circular, centered exactly on our location, growing stronger by the hour. The temperature drops drastically as night approaches. Equipment malfunctions. Compasses spin wildly, and our GPS devices show coordinates that change every second. We're effectively cut off from the outside world. Mike finds more records. Medical reports from 1824 describing identical structures. The bones in those structures were carbon dated to be thousands of years old. Yet here we are, finding the same configurations with bones that look just as ancient as we piece together the historical evidence. A horrible realization dawns. We haven't just stumbled upon these artifacts. We've awakened something that's been waiting for us. The storm traps us in the base camp, but the real horror lies in what we're uncovering. An anthropologist's tape from 1973 plays through our battery-powered recorder. Her voice trembles as she describes a ritual she witnessed. Native shamans attempting to seal something away. The recording ends with rhythmic chanting and a scream that makes the speakers crackle. Through fragmented radio communications with the outside world, we learn that similar structures are appearing across the park, always in a precise geometric pattern, forming a massive symbol visible only from above. Our bone shelter is just one point in an elaborate design. The pattern is growing, spreading like a cancer across the landscape. Each new structure brings with it an oppressive silence, as if nature itself is retreating. Chen's translation of ancient Athabascan texts reveals the true purpose of the bone shelters. They're not markers, they're anchors, holding something in place. The natives believed that every century an entity they called the Bone Weaver would stir in its sleep, reaching out to collect new materials for its grotesque architecture. The rituals were meant to keep it dormant, but now, after centuries of containment, it's breaking free. The missing hiker's camera is found near one of the new structures. The footage shows them discovering the first shelter 5 days ago as they approach. Shadows move independently of light sources. The final frame shows a figure composed entirely of shifting bones, towering above the trees. The timestamp matches exactly with when our instruments started failing. Sarah's research connects everything. The geometric pattern of the shelters matches astronomical alignments that occur once every 100 years. Tonight is the convergence. The entity doesn't just collect bones, it harvests them during these alignments, using the structures as focus points for something larger. Each shelter is a piece of a massive ritual site, and we're standing in the center. A USB drive arrives via emergency courier. The last communication we'll receive before the storm cuts us off completely. It contains classified government files dating back to World War II. The military knew about these events. They documented the cycle, studied the structures, and reached a terrifying conclusion. The bone shelters aren't just prisons or markers. They're incubators, preparing for something that happens every century when the stars align. The wind howls with voices now, hundreds of them, screaming in languages dead for centuries. We've retreated to the highest level of the ranger station, but the bone structures are multiplying below us. They rise from the earth like terrible flowers, assembling themselves from remains that couldn't possibly be there. Each one pulses with a sickly light that grows stronger as night approaches. Tom disappears during a supply run to the helicopter. We find his camera, still recording. The footage shows him backing away from something off-screen, his breath forming clouds in suddenly freezing air. The last frame captures his shadow on the snow, but it's not his shadow anymore. It's articulated like a puppet made of bones. Moving independently as he tries to run, the temperature plummets to impossible levels. Ice forms in patterns that mirror the geometric layout of the bone shelters. Mike identifies them as molecular structures. The cold is literally rewriting the chemistry of our environment. Chen spots movement through his binoculars. Dark shapes moving between the structures, collecting. They're not human, not anymore. Sarah's last weather reading reveals the storm's true nature. It's not meteorological, it's metaphysical. The pattern of the bone shelters is creating a vortex, drawing energy from the earth itself. The alignments she tracked aren't just astronomical. They're opening something. A door that opens once every 100 years when the stars are right and the sacrifices are prepared. We lose Mike next. One moment he's beside us, the next he's gone. Just the sound of bones clicking together where he stood. His radio activates an hour later, broadcasting the sound of construction. Through the station windows, we watch a new shelter rise. Larger than the others, the bones used to build it are still fresh. Chen makes a breakthrough in translating the final passages of the Athabascan texts, but it's too late to help us. The bone shelters aren't just structures. They're components of a larger organism, a skeletal lattice that spreads for miles. We're not witnessing an awakening, we're witnessing a metamorphosis, and as the last light fades from the sky, we realize we're not just trapped in this place, we're part of what it's becoming. The stars align overhead, visible through the supernatural storm. The geometric pattern of bone shelters begins to pulse with a deep, resonant frequency that shakes the earth. Sarah, Chen, and I are all that's left, watching as the ground between the structures splits open, revealing a network of massive bones that have been growing beneath the park for centuries. Ancient recordings hidden in the ranger station's archives play themselves, filling the air with shamanic chants. Chen recognizes them. They're not prayers or rituals of containment. They're a warning, describing what happens when the Bone Weaver finally completes its century-long metamorphosis. The pattern isn't just a symbol or a door, it's a blueprint for something massive, something that's been building itself from the inside out. The true horror reveals itself as the structures begin to move. They're not independent buildings. They're joints and vertebrae of something that's been sleeping under Denali for millennia. Each disappearance, each new shelter, was another piece being added to its skeleton. The missing hikers, Tom, Mike, they weren't taken, they were absorbed, becoming part of its growing form. Sarah's final calculations come too late. The astronomical alignment isn't just waking the entity, it's completing a gestation cycle that began before recorded history. The storms, the cold, the geometric patterns, all of it was leading to this moment. As the last stars lock into position, the ground tears open completely. What rises from the earth is beyond comprehension. A titan of bone and shadow, ancient and new at once, assembled from every victim it has claimed across centuries. Chen pushes me into the emergency bunker as the creature rises fully, its form blotting out the stars. Sarah's last act is to trigger the emergency protocols, sealing me inside. Through the bunker's monitors, I watch as they're lifted into the air, their bodies dissolving and reconstructing as part of the entity's ever-growing form. The screams of centuries of victims echo through the facility as the creature celebrates its rebirth. In the bunker's archives, I find the final piece of the puzzle, a seismic survey from 1924. The entire park sits on a skeleton of impossible size, accumulated over thousands of years. What we saw wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. As I record this final entry, I can hear it moving above, adding my colleagues to its eternal construction project. The cycle isn't every 100 years, that's just when it wakes to feed. Now it's awake, hungry, and the century of preparation is complete. The Bone Weaver isn't confined to Denali anymore. It's ready to roam, and as I feel the bunker walls begin to shift and reconstruct around me, I realize with horror that nowhere on Earth is truly solid ground. Under every mountain, every city, its structures are waiting to rise. I never thought I'd be the one to uncover something this disturbing. As a wildlife photographer with 15 years of experience capturing the raw beauty of Rocky Mountain, I've seen my share of strange occurrences, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered last Thursday. My trail cameras were meant to capture the migration patterns of elk herds, not become instruments of nightmare fuel. The first anomaly appeared in batch 37 of my weekly collections, a family of 3, clearly visible, walking along the marked trail near Baker's Peak, their colorful hiking gear contrasting sharply against the dense pine forest backdrop. The timestamps showed regular 10-second intervals between shots, standard for my research protocol. But what happened next defied every natural law I knew. In the subsequent image, they were gone, not obscured, not out of frame, simply vanished at first. I assumed it was a technical glitch, a corrupted file perhaps. I've dealt with equipment malfunctions before, and while annoying, they're part of the job. But as I began cross-referencing the timestamps with my other cameras positioned along the trail, a chilling pattern emerged. Camera B2, positioned 50 yards ahead, should have caught them emerging from the tree line. It didn't. Neither did cameras C4, D1, or any of the dozen others strategically placed along that 5-mile stretch. The rational part of my brain tried desperately to explain it away. Maybe they'd ventured off the marked path between shots, though the dense undergrowth made that nearly impossible in 10 seconds. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a camera malfunction, or some elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew I was witnessing something far more sinister. The family's expressions in that last photo, their peaceful, unaware smiles, haunt me now. They had no idea they were walking into what? I still can't say for certain. That night, sleep eluded me as I pored over years of archived footage. My hands trembled as patterns began emerging from the data. Subtle at first, but undeniable once you knew what to look for. Over the past 3 years, my cameras had captured 27 similar incidents, 27 groups or individuals who appeared in one frame and vanished in the next. The authorities had missing persons reports for some of them, but not all. How many disappearances had gone unnoticed? How many people had simply vanished without anyone connecting the dots? The most disturbing aspect wasn't just the disappearances themselves, but the commonality I discovered in the metadata. All vanishings occurred between 3:15 p.m. and 4:45 p.m., regardless of the season, The temperature readings from my cameras showed sudden, localized drops of 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in the exact moments people vanished, and in every case, the electromagnetic interference readings, a feature I'd installed to track potential equipment disturbances, spiked dramatically. This wasn't random. There was a pattern, a purpose, a terrifying clockwork precision to these events. The decision to investigate further wasn't really a decision at all. It was an imperative. I couldn't simply sit on this information, knowing that more unsuspecting hikers might vanish into whatever nightmare realm awaited them on that seemingly innocuous trail. Tomorrow, I'll head out there myself, armed with every piece of monitoring equipment I can carry. If something is hunting on my mountain, I'm going to find out what it is. Though as I pack my gear and write this entry, I can't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I'm walking willingly into the same trap that has claimed so many others. But someone has to expose the truth, even if that truth defies everything we think we know about reality. The local library's archives provided more questions than answers, but what I found sent chills down my spine. Newspaper clippings dating back to the 1800s detailed similar disappearances. Though they were often attributed to bear attacks or exposure to the elements, the pattern was there, hidden in yellowed papers and faded ink. Every report, every missing person, vanishing in that same 90-minute window between 3:15 and 4:45 p.m. The more I dug, the more the pieces started fitting together, forming a picture more terrifying than I could have imagined. Mrs. Henderson, the ancient librarian who'd worked here since before I was born, noticed my research focus and approached me with trembling hands. She pulled me aside, her voice barely above a whisper, and told me about her grandfather, a Ute tribal elder who'd warned about the shadow times in Rocky Mountain. According to their oral traditions, certain areas of the forest served as doorways between worlds, but not in the way most people might imagine. These weren't portals to other physical places, but to somewhere much darker. Spaces between reality where ancient beings dwelled. The Ute stories spoke of a bargain made centuries ago. A deal with entities that existed before time itself. The mountains were their domain, and they allowed humans to live and hunt there under one condition: tribute. The disappearances weren't random, they were calculated, precise, a form of payment in human souls. The tribe had marked these areas with warning symbols, but settlers had destroyed or ignored them, building trails right through the forbidden zones. As Mrs. Henderson spoke, her eyes darted nervously around the empty library, as if speaking of these things might summon them. Deep in the basement archives, I found a journal belonging to a surveyor from 1892. His entries grew increasingly frantic as he documented similar phenomena to what my cameras had captured. He described tears in the air, moments where reality seemed to ripple and fold in on itself. But most disturbing were his sketches, crude drawings of impossible geometries and beings that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our minds could process. The final entry, dated October 15th, 1892, simply read, "They're not taking them, they're collecting what was already theirs." My research led me to cross-reference geological surveys with reported disappearances, and a clear picture emerged. Every incident occurred along ley lines, ancient paths of electromagnetic energy that crisscrossed the mountain range. The Native Americans had known about these lines, building their sacred sites well away from them. Modern trails, however, often followed these paths precisely, drawn perhaps by some unconscious pull to the straightest routes through the wilderness. We'd built our paths right through their hunting grounds. The final piece fell into place when I discovered a classified government report from 1976. Hidden among mundane Forest Service documents, a research team had documented intense electromagnetic anomalies in the exact areas where my cameras had captured the disappearances. Their equipment had recorded energy signatures unlike anything they'd ever seen. But the study was suddenly abandoned after 3 researchers vanished during their investigation. The report's final recommendation was chilling. Further study inadvisable. Some doors are better left closed. The morning air bit at my face as I shouldered my pack, loaded with more scientific equipment than camping gear. The trail ahead seemed innocuous enough in the early light, but I knew better now. My GPS marked the hotspots where disappearances had occurred, creating a constellation of death across my topographic map. I'd chosen to begin my investigation at the site of the most recent incident, where that family of 3 had vanished. The weight of my camera felt reassuring against my chest, though I wondered if it would make any difference against whatever I might encounter. The first signs that something was wrong came around noon. My compasses, I'd brought 3 different types, began spinning erratically. The digital ones simply died, their screens flickering out one by one. The temperature dropped rapidly, my breath visible despite the autumn sun overhead. The forest had gone silent. That unnatural quiet that every outdoorsman knows means danger. But this was different. Not just the absence of animal sounds, but the absence of everything. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving me in a pocket of dead air. That's when I saw him, the survivor. He stumbled out of the brush like a wounded animal, his clothes torn and dirty, his eyes wild with a madness I'd only seen in war documentaries. He grabbed my jacket with surprising strength, his cracked nails digging into the fabric. "They're watching," he whispered, his voice hoarse as if he'd been screaming. "They're always watching." He was Jacob Martinez, I would later learn, reported missing 3 weeks ago. What he'd seen in that time had shattered his mind, but the fragments of his story chilled me to the bone. He spoke of shadows that moved against the light, of spaces between the trees that led to places that shouldn't exist. "Time doesn't work right there," he kept saying, rocking back and forth. "Sometimes you live the same moment forever. Sometimes you experience 1,000 years in a second." But the worst part was when he described the entities he'd encountered, beings that his mind couldn't properly process, leaving him with only broken metaphors. "Like geometry gone wrong," he muttered. "Angels made of angles that hurt your eyes to see." As Jacob rambled, I noticed something odd about his shadow. It didn't quite match his movements, seeming to lag behind by a fraction of a second when I pointed my camera at him. The viewfinder showed strange distortions around his form, as if reality itself was having trouble rendering him properly. He noticed my interest and began laughing, a horrible sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. "They let me go," he said, his voice suddenly clear. "They let me go because I'm not me anymore. They hollowed me out and filled me with eyes." Suddenly Jacob's head snapped up, his body going rigid. "It's starting," he whispered, terror evident in his voice. My watch read 3:14 p.m. The air began to feel thick, like trying to breathe underwater. The trees around us seemed to bend in impossible ways, their shadows stretching and twisting into shapes that hurt to look at. Jacob started screaming, not in fear, but as if in response to some signal I couldn't hear. As I raised my camera to document whatever was about to happen, I realized with horror that his shadow had completely separated from his body, rising up like a dark tide ready to engulf us both. The world folded. That's the only way I can describe it. Reality crumpled like paper, and I felt myself being pulled through the creases. Jacob's screams cut off abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. When my vision cleared, I was still in the forest, but everything was wrong. The trees grew sideways, their branches twisting in patterns that defied Euclidean geometry. The sky above, or what I thought was above, had the texture of churning oil, deep purples and greens swirling in ways that made my mind recoil. In this twisted space, my equipment went haywire. My camera's display showed impossibly long exposure times, hours compressed into milliseconds. The temperature gauge rapidly cycled between absolute zero and numbers it wasn't designed to display. Most disturbing was my phone's camera roll. It now contained thousands of photos I hadn't taken, showing places and things that couldn't exist. In some of them, I saw the missing hikers, their faces frozen in expressions of awe and terror as they encountered what I was seeing now. The entities revealed themselves gradually, as if allowing my mind time to adjust to their impossible existence. They moved through the twisted space like living fractal patterns, each limb branching into infinite smaller copies of itself. Their bodies seemed to exist in more dimensions than I could perceive, with parts disappearing and reappearing as they intersected with our reality. They didn't communicate in words, but I felt their thoughts pressing against my consciousness like cold fingers probing a wound. They were curious about us, but in the way a child might be curious about insects before pulling their wings off. Through this psychic connection, I learned the terrible truth. This wasn't their dimension. It was the space between dimensions. A buffer zone they'd created to study our reality. The disappearances weren't random acts of malevolence. They were carefully calculated experiments. Each victim was chosen to help them understand different aspects of human consciousness. Some were subjected to temporal distortions, living entire lifetimes in moments. Others were taken apart and reassembled in ways that defied physics. Their minds stretched across multiple realities simultaneously. Jacob's fate became clear as I watched him float past me, his body transparent and filled with swirling cosmos. He hadn't escaped. He'd been converted into a living window, a means for them to observe our world through human eyes. The family I'd seen disappear in my trail camera photos was there too, each member suspended in a different configuration of space-time, their consciousness spread across multiple probability streams. They were both alive and dead, here and everywhere. Experiencing every possible version of their fate simultaneously, the beings showed me their collection. Centuries of human specimens preserved in various states of dimensional flux. Each one was labeled with complex mathematical symbols that I somehow understood represented different aspects of consciousness they were studying. Some victims were caught in temporal loops, experiencing their last moments of normal reality over and over. Others had been transformed into living mathematical equations, their bodies reduced to pure information. The entities were building a comprehensive model of human consciousness, not out of malice, but out of an alien curiosity that was perhaps even more terrifying in its cold, clinical detachment. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. They were preparing for something. Each disappearance, each experiment was part of a larger pattern. They weren't just studying us. They were learning how to reshape human consciousness itself. The dimensional space around me shifted, revealing vast structures that seemed to pulse with accumulated knowledge. Centuries of research, countless human subjects, all building toward a singular purpose. They were creating a bridge, a permanent connection between their reality and ours. The entities allowed me to comprehend their grand design. Perhaps because they knew I could never stop it. The disappearances were accelerating because they were close to their goal. Each victim's consciousness was being used like a brick in an impossible architecture, creating a framework that would allow their dimension to merge with ours. The time window, 3:15 to 4:45 p.m., wasn't chosen randomly. It was when the dimensional barriers were naturally thinnest, allowing them to work with minimal energy expenditure. They had been patient, methodical, working toward this moment for longer than human civilization had existed. I watched in horror as they initiated the next phase of their plan. The very fabric of reality began to tear, creating windows through which I could see familiar places transformed by their influence. Rocky Mountain was just the beginning. Similar experiments had been conducted at locations worldwide, each creating anchor points for their eventual emergence. The missing hikers weren't just victims, they were unwitting pioneers, their transformed consciousnesses serving as guideposts for the entity's invasion of our dimension. My camera, still somehow functioning in this impossible space, captured images that defied comprehension. Each photo showed a different stage of the transformation process, from human to something else entirely. But in the last few frames, I noticed something the entities hadn't intended to reveal. A pattern of vulnerability. The dimensional barriers they were weakening could be strengthened by the same human consciousness they were harvesting. Their own experiments had created a potential weapon against them. With this knowledge came a terrible choice. I could feel their influence trying to reshape my mind, prepare me for integration into their collection. But I also knew I could use that connection to disrupt their entire operation. It would require a sacrifice. My own consciousness, fragmented and dispersed through their network like a virus. I would cease to exist as myself, but the feedback loop created would seal the dimensional bridges, trapping them in their own space between spaces. As I write these final words, my body is already beginning to dissolve, my consciousness spreading through their network like wildfire. The camera containing these photos and this account will be found on the trail, exactly where I entered their domain. To whoever finds this, the disappearances will stop now, but at a cost. Remember us, the ones who vanished, not as victims, but as the final barrier between our world and theirs. The entities will remain trapped in their dimensional prison, studying their collected specimens for eternity, but never again reaching through to harvest more. In my last moments of human consciousness, I'm at peace knowing that sometimes the only way to fight monsters is to become something else entirely, neither human nor entity, but a guardian at the gates between worlds. The endless expanse of the Everglades stretched before me like a forgotten world, its murky waters holding secrets I wasn't yet ready to uncover. 3 months had passed since Sarah signed the divorce papers, leaving me with nothing but my research equipment and a broken spirit. The position at Everglades National Park came as a lifeline, a chance to lose myself in work rather than memories. Little did I know that the waters I was about to study held horrors far worse than my personal demons. The first week passed without incident, collecting water samples and analyzing the strange patterns of fish migration that had brought me here. But everything changed during that first full moon. I was taking measurements near Taylor Slough when my equipment detected an anomaly, a massive structure, clearly artificial, lying beneath the dark waters. The readings suggested it was ancient, predating European settlement by centuries. My rational mind tried to dismiss it as a natural formation. But the perfect geometric patterns visible on my sonar told a different story. As dusk approached, I noticed something peculiar about the water around my boat. The usually brown-green surface had taken on an otherworldly sheen, like oil mixed with phosphorescent algae. I reached down to collect a sample, and that's when I saw it. A pulsing green light emanating from the depths. It wasn't like anything I'd ever encountered in my 15 years of marine biology. The light seemed to move with purpose, following the contours of the submerged structure I'd detected earlier. The local rangers had warned me about the dangers of staying out after dark, but their concerns had focused on alligators and getting lost in the labyrinthine waterways. None of them had mentioned the lights. When I radioed back to base about my discovery, the response was strange. A long silence, followed by a terse instruction to return immediately. The tension in Ranger Martinez's voice sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. That night, as I lay in my small cabin reviewing the day's data, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something that should have remained hidden. The water samples I'd collected showed impossible readings, compounds that shouldn't exist in nature, energy signatures that defied explanation. But it was the dream that truly shook me. Ancient stone structures rising from the depths, covered in glowing symbols that seemed to whisper in a language older than civilization itself. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a product of stress and isolation, but when I checked my equipment, the readings were still there, pulsing like a beacon from the deep. And now, as I write this log entry, I can see something moving outside my window, a faint green glow reflecting off the water, drawing closer with each passing moment. The rational part of my mind says it's just bioluminescent algae, but deep down, I know better. Something in those ancient waters has noticed me, and I'm beginning to think my discovery of the underwater structure wasn't an accident at all. I spent the next few days gathering courage to dive near the structure. The park's historical record showed no mention of indigenous buildings in this area, yet sonar imaging revealed what appeared to be a massive temple complex, perfectly preserved beneath the murky waters. When I finally decided to dive, the water was unnaturally warm around the structure. Despite the February chill, the visibility was poor, but my hands traced patterns in the stone that seemed to shift beneath my touch. As if the very material was alive, the temple's architecture defied logic. Angles that shouldn't be possible, corridors that seemed to bend reality itself. My camera captured images of hieroglyphs unlike anything documented in North American archaeology. They depicted creatures emerging from the water, taking human form, and performing rituals beneath a green moon. Most disturbing were the dates carved beside these images. They predated known human civilization by thousands of years. As I photographed the last panel, my dive computer began to malfunction, its screen displaying impossible depths and warning signals I'd never seen before. That night, the full moon rose again, and the temple came alive. Green light pulsed through the water in rhythmic patterns, like a heartbeat from the earth itself. I watched in horror as fish began swimming in unnatural formations, creating spiral patterns that mimicked the hieroglyphs I'd photographed earlier. The water seemed to whisper in a language that felt ancient yet familiar, as if it were speaking directly to something primal in my DNA. When I checked my recordings later, the whispers were there, distinct voices speaking in a tongue that made my skin crawl. Local authorities started taking notice of my research. Ranger Martinez visited my cabin, asking pointed questions about my findings. But it was what he didn't say that troubled me most. His eyes kept darting to the water, and he refused to stay after sunset. Before leaving, he pressed a worn journal into my hands, explaining it belonged to a researcher who disappeared here 30 years ago. The journal's final entries described similar green lights and whispers from the deep. The last page contained a single sentence: "They're not structures, they're waiting." My ex-wife Sarah called that evening. The first time since the divorce, she'd had dreams about me, she said. Dreams of green light and ancient stones. She described structures she couldn't possibly have known about, and mentioned whispers in a language that shouldn't exist. When I asked how she knew these things, her response chilled me to the bone. "They showed me, David. They're showing everyone who's connected to you." The line went dead after that, and all attempts to call back failed. The following morning, I discovered my research samples had changed overnight. The water, previously clear in its collection tubes, now contained traces of an unknown metallic substance that glowed faintly green in darkness. Under the microscope, the particles moved with apparent purpose. Arranging themselves into patterns identical to the hieroglyphs from the temple, my computer model suggested they were unlike any known element on Earth, exhibiting properties that violated our understanding of physics. As I stared at the samples, a terrifying thought occurred to me. What if the structures weren't built by ancient humans at all? The journal Ranger Martinez gave me became my obsession. Its pages revealed a dark history of the Everglades that no official record acknowledged. The researcher, Dr. Emily Blackwood, had documented similar findings across multiple sites in the park. Her research suggested the structures were part of a vast network, all connected by the mysterious green energy that seemed to pulse stronger with each passing day. But it was her interviews with the indigenous Miccosukee elders that truly caught my attention. They spoke of the Deep Ones, entities that had dwelled in these waters long before humans walked the earth. As I delved deeper into local folklore, patterns emerged that couldn't be dismissed as mere superstition. Every 50 years, during a specific lunar cycle, people would vanish in the Everglades. The disappearances were always preceded by reports of green lights in the water and whispers in an unknown language. The Miccosukee called it the time of return, when the barrier between our world and theirs grew thin. According to their legends, the submerged structures weren't temples, they were doorways. The thought made my recent discoveries even more disturbing. The park's archaeological records revealed another unsettling detail. During the 1960s, a team of researchers had attempted to excavate one of the structures. All 7 members of the team vanished, leaving behind equipment that had been twisted and altered in ways that defied explanation. The official report cited an airboat accident, but photos from the site showed their camp surrounded by pools of water that glowed green in the darkness. The investigation was suddenly closed, and the area was marked as restricted due to environmental concerns. My own research was beginning to show impossible results. The water samples I'd collected contained microscopic organisms that shouldn't exist. Creatures with DNA structures unlike anything in Earth's evolutionary history. Under the microscope, they seemed to respond to thought, changing their behavior when observed. More disturbing still, I began finding traces of these organisms in my blood work. Something was changing inside me, altering my perception. I could now see patterns in the water that were invisible before, and the whispers were becoming clearer with each passing night. The truth about Dr. Blackwood's disappearance finally emerged from cross-referencing various reports. She hadn't simply vanished. She'd made a discovery that connected everything. Her final samples, still preserved in the park's archives, contained fragments of technology that appeared to be millions of years old. Analysis suggested they were part of a larger mechanism, one that used the entire Everglades as a vast machine. The structures weren't just doorways, they were components of something massive, something that had been waiting beneath the waters since before mankind existed. Late one night, as I reviewed security footage from my research site, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The green lights weren't random. They were forming complex mathematical patterns that matched theoretical models for dimensional gateways. Dr. Blackwood had recognized these patterns too, right before she disappeared. But she'd left behind one final note that I'd only just decoded. They're not trying to come through the doorways. They're trying to open them wider. And we're the key they've been waiting for. The dreams became more vivid each night, filled with visions of vast underwater cities and beings that defied description. In these dreams I understood their language, comprehended their purpose. They had seeded Earth with life billions of years ago, creating humanity as vessels for their eventual return. The structures in the Everglades weren't just doorways. They were incubators designed to gradually alter human DNA over thousands of generations. Each mysterious disappearance had been carefully orchestrated, each victim chosen for their genetic potential. Sarah's involvement wasn't coincidental. Our divorce, my job offer at the park, everything had been orchestrated. Through my blood work, I discovered we shared a rare genetic marker, one that appeared in every historical record of disappearances in the Everglades. Dr. Blackwood had possessed it too. This marker wasn't a natural mutation. It was engineered, designed to activate under specific conditions. The green light from the structures wasn't just illumination. It was a catalyst, triggering changes that had been dormant in our DNA for millennia. The prophecy I found carved into the underwater temple's deepest chamber confirmed my worst fears. It spoke of a convergence, a time when the chosen ones would facilitate the return of the ancient beings. The symbols matched perfectly with astronomical calculations pointing to an upcoming lunar event, a moment when the moon's position would exactly mirror its placement from 50,000 years ago. The water samples revealed increasing concentrations of the unknown element, suggesting something massive was building beneath the surface. Ranger Martinez finally revealed his true identity. He was a member of an ancient order dedicated to monitoring the structures, descendants of indigenous shamans who had understood the true nature of the threat. They had been powerless to prevent the cyclic disappearances, but they documented everything, building a repository of knowledge about the beings and their plans. The Order believed that this cycle was different. It wasn't just about taking a few chosen ones. The beings were preparing for a full emergence. My transformation accelerated as the lunar convergence approached. I could breathe underwater for increasingly long periods, and my vision had adapted to see clearly in the darkest depths. The whispers were now a constant chorus in my mind, revealing secrets about the universe that no human was meant to know. Other changes were more disturbing. My skin had developed a faint luminescence, and my blood under the microscope showed structures that were distinctly non-human. I was becoming something else, something that bridged two worlds. The final revelation came when I managed to translate the complete text of the prophecy. It wasn't just predicting the return of these ancient beings. It was describing a transformation of the entire planet. The Everglades structures were part of a global network, all waiting to activate simultaneously. Humanity had never been the dominant species on Earth. We were an experiment, carefully crafted and guided toward this moment. And I, along with others like me, had been designed as the keys to unlock a door that should remain forever closed. The lunar convergence arrived with an otherworldly tide that turned the entire Everglades an ethereal green. From my transformed perspective, I could see the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The entire region was a vast organic machine, its waterways forming circuits that channeled ancient energies. The structures were now fully activated, their surfaces crawling with symbols that burned themselves into reality itself. All across the park, people with the genetic marker were being drawn to the water, their DNA singing in harmony with the cosmic frequency that pulsed from the depths. Sarah arrived at my cabin just before midnight, her eyes glowing with the same inner light that now emanated from my transformed flesh. We weren't just chosen ones, we were catalysts, our very existence designed to facilitate the grand emergence. The beings who had engineered humanity had been patient, waiting countless millennia for precisely this moment. As we stood at the water's edge, we could feel them stirring beneath, vast intelligences awakening from an age-long slumber. The choice before us was simple but terrible: resist and maintain humanity's illusory dominion over Earth, or surrender to our true purpose. The Order of Shamans made their final move, revealing an ancient ritual they claimed could seal the doorways permanently, but their knowledge was incomplete. The ritual wouldn't just close the gates, it would unravel the very foundations of life on Earth. Every living thing carried traces of the engineers' work, and undoing their influence would cascade through the evolutionary chain, unmaking billions of years of careful manipulation. The weight of this choice pressed down on me as the waters began to rise, carrying with them echoes of a truth too vast for human minds to comprehend. In those final moments, as reality itself seemed to bend around the activated structures, I understood why Dr. Blackwood had disappeared. She hadn't been taken. She had chosen to go through the doorway, understanding that someone needed to witness what lay beyond. The beings hadn't been waiting to invade our world. They were waiting to welcome us into theirs. The transformation affecting me and the others wasn't a corruption of human nature, but an awakening to our true form, a form that had been hidden within our genes since the first humans walked the earth. The water rose around us, no longer bound by normal physics, creating impossible architectures of liquid light. The ancient beings emerged not as conquerors, but as guides, their forms both beautiful and terrible in their alien majesty. They showed us visions of worlds beyond human imagination, realities where the laws of physics were mere suggestions, and consciousness itself took forms we had never dreamed possible. The true purpose of the Everglades structures was finally clear. They weren't just doorways or machines, but chrysalises, designed to facilitate humanity's metamorphosis. In the end, the choice was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. The green light that had haunted my dreams was neither good nor evil. It was change itself, the inexorable tide of evolution that had always been coming for humanity. As Sarah and I stepped into the transformative waters, joining others who had heard the call, we understood that this wasn't an ending but a beginning. The beings hadn't created humanity as vessels for their return. They had created us as their children, waiting until we were ready to join them in the vast cosmic ocean of consciousness. The Everglades would remain a mystery to those left behind, its waters holding the secret of humanity's true destiny, waiting for the next cycle of awakening to begin. The desert wind whispers through the Joshua trees as I drive down the winding road toward the heart of the national park. My camera equipment rattles in the back seat, a comforting sound that's accompanied me through countless assignments, but this time feels different. The setting sun casts long shadows across the landscape, making the twisted forms of the ancient trees look like frozen dancers in the dying light. I've covered strange stories before, but reports of moving trees, that's a new one, even for me. Park Ranger Sarah Martinez meets me at the visitor center, her usual welcoming smile replaced by a tightness around her eyes that sets me on edge. "Mason Parker," she asks, checking my press credentials with unusual thoroughness. "I need to be clear about something. If you're here to sensationalize what's happening, you should leave now." Her words carry a weight that seems disproportionate to the situation. I assure her I'm here for the truth. Whatever that might be, She looks at me for a long moment before nodding, though the tension never leaves her shoulders. As we walk to my designated camping area, Sarah fills me in on the official story. 3 separate groups of campers reporting identical experiences over the past month. They'd wake to find their tents surrounded by Joshua trees that hadn't been there when they set up camp, with strange symbols carved into the desert floor. "The thing is," she says, stopping abruptly and lowering her voice, "I've worked here for 15 years, these trees. They don't just move, not naturally." She pulls out her phone, showing me photos that make my blood run cold. Perfect circles of trees around abandoned campsites, and symbols that look ancient, yet somehow fresh in the desert sand. The sun has almost set when I reach my campsite, and the temperature is dropping rapidly. As I set up my equipment, cameras with motion sensors, infrared triggers, and time-lapse capabilities, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The Joshua trees stand like silent sentinels around the perimeter of my site, their branches reaching toward the darkening sky like gnarled fingers. I tell myself it's just my imagination playing tricks, sparked by the ranger's obvious unease and the bizarre nature of the assignment. Late into the night, I sit reviewing historical documents Sarah provided about the park. My blood turns to ice as I read about a pattern of disappearances dating back to the early 1900s. Every few decades, campers would vanish without a trace, their sites found surrounded by circles of Joshua trees. The local Kawila tribe had warnings about this place, about nights when the ancient ones would walk, but the records are frustratingly vague. The wind picks up outside my tent, and for a moment I swear I hear something that sounds like footsteps dragging through the sand. Just before midnight, my camera equipment starts malfunctioning. The sensors trigger randomly, but when I check the footage, there's nothing there. The temperature has dropped dramatically, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight as I step outside to check the cameras. I freeze. The Joshua trees seem closer. I know it's impossible, but I could swear they've moved several feet toward my tent. And there, in the sand at my feet, the first line of a symbol begins to appear, as if being carved by an invisible hand. The strange symbol completed itself before my eyes, the lines appearing one by one in the sand. Like a ghostly finger was tracing them. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Wind patterns, desert mirages, exhaustion from the long drive, but nothing could explain what happened next. The sound started as a low groan, like wood straining against wind, but there was no breeze. The Joshua trees began to sway, their twisted limbs moving with deliberate purpose rather than natural motion. I stood transfixed, my camera forgotten in my trembling hands. The trees were moving, not swaying, not bending, actually moving across the desert floor, their roots pulling free from the sand like legs awakening from ancient slumber. I watched, paralyzed, as they began a slow, methodical dance, drawing closer to my campsite with each passing minute. The groaning grew louder, punctuated by the sound of shifting sand and cracking wood. My photographer's instincts finally kicked in, and I raised my camera, but every shot came out blurred or completely black, as if the very act of recording was being prevented by some unseen force. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as the trees continued their inexorable approach. The symbol in the sand began to glow with a faint, pulsing blue light that cast strange shadows across the desert floor. More symbols appeared, forming a complex pattern that spread outward from my tent like a spiderweb. The temperature dropped even further, and my breath came out in thick white clouds that hung motionless in the unnaturally still air. The trees had nearly formed a complete circle now, their branches reaching toward me like grasping hands. A voice behind me made me jump. "They have chosen you." I spun around to find an elderly Native American woman standing at the edge of the symbol-covered ground. She seemed unsurprised by the impossible scene unfolding around us. "I am Maria Redhawk," she said, her dark eyes reflecting the ethereal blue glow from the ground. "The Kawila have watched over this place for generations, waiting for nights like these." She stepped carefully around the glowing symbols, making her way toward me. "The ancient ones are awakening, and they are hungry." Maria's words sent chills down my spine, but before I could question her, the ground beneath my feet began to vibrate. The symbols pulsed more intensely, and the trees had now formed a perfect circle around my campsite. Their branches intertwined above us, creating a canopy that blocked out the desert sky. "Every century they choose," Maria continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that seemed to synchronize with the pulsing symbols. "The trees are their shepherds, marking those who will feed the hunger that sleeps beneath the desert." The groaning of wood reached a crescendo, and suddenly every branch of every tree pointed directly at me. Maria's expression was grave as she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You must come with me now," she insisted, pulling me toward a gap in the circle that was rapidly closing. "Once the circle is complete, the marking cannot be undone. The hunger will follow you wherever you go, and the trees—" She glanced at the writhing Joshua trees with ancient fear in her eyes. "The trees will ensure you return when the time comes." We barely made it through the gap before it sealed behind us, the trees standing sentinel around my abandoned campsite, waiting in their new formation as if they had been there for centuries. Maria's small house sat on the outskirts of 29 palms, its walls adorned with ancient Cahuilla symbols that matched those I'd seen in the sand. She moved through the dimly lit room, burning sage and murmuring prayers in her native tongue. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I clutched the cup of tea she'd given me, my mind still struggling to process what I'd witnessed. The photos on my camera had all come out corrupted, showing nothing but static and strange shadows where the trees should have been. "The Joshua trees are not what they appear to be," Maria began, settling into an old armchair across from me. "They are the anchors, the watchers, the shepherds of something far older than humanity." She pulled out an ancient leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. "My grandmother's grandmother wrote this, documenting the cycle we've witnessed for generations." As she opened it, I recognized drawings of the same symbols I'd seen in the sand. Every 100 years, the hunger beneath the desert grows too strong to contain. The trees choose those who will satisfy it. The implications of her words started to sink in, and I remembered the missing persons reports I'd found. "The disappearances," I whispered. "They weren't random." Maria nodded grimly. "The trees mark their chosen with the symbols, creating a connection that cannot be broken. Those marked will feel an irresistible pull back to this place when the time comes." She turned to a page, showing a detailed drawing of the desert floor split open, revealing something massive and ancient below. "Our ancestors made a pact with what lives beneath the sands. The sacrifices keep it sleeping without them." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. When I tried to call Sarah, my phone displayed the same symbols I'd seen in the sand before going dark. Maria watched with knowing eyes. "You cannot leave now," she said softly. "The mark is upon you, and the desert will not let you go. I've seen others try. They never make it past the county line." She showed me more entries in the journal, stories of marked ones who tried to escape. Their cars would break down. Roads would mysteriously lead them in circles. And always, the Joshua trees would appear wherever they went, standing watch, as if to confirm her words. I looked out her window and felt my heart stop. There, in her front yard, where none had been before, stood a Joshua tree. Its branches were oriented toward the house. Toward me, like an accusing finger. Maria didn't seem surprised. "They will follow you now, watching, waiting. The hunger stirs stronger this cycle. I feel it in my bones. Something is different this time." She turned to the last written page in the journal, and my blood ran cold. The entire page was covered in the same symbol that had first appeared at my feet in the desert. But here it was accompanied by a single line of text. "When the seven are marked, the sleeper will wake." The room suddenly felt too small, too close. I needed air, needed to think, needed to find a way out of this nightmare. But as I stepped onto Maria's porch, my heart sank. Where her front yard had once opened onto an empty desert street, there now stood a perfect circle of Joshua trees, their branches swaying despite the still air. And at my feet, glowing softly in the darkness, fresh symbols began to appear in the dust. The next 3 days became a blur of increasingly desperate attempts to escape. Every road I took somehow led back to Joshua Tree National Park. My GPS would start showing those ancient symbols before failing completely. Gas stations appeared abandoned when I approached them, their pumps dead, forcing me to return to the same central area. The trees appeared everywhere I went, outside motels, in parking lots, along the roadside. Their silent vigil a constant reminder of my marked status. Even my dreams were invaded by visions of roots moving through sand and branches reaching for the stars. During one of my failed escape attempts, I discovered something that changed everything. In a small, forgotten museum on the outskirts of town, I found photographs dating back to the 1920s. They showed the same patterns: circles of trees, glowing symbols, disappeared campers. But one detail caught my eye. In each cycle, there were always 7 victims. I was the first of this cycle. As I studied the old photographs more closely, I noticed something else. In the background of each image, barely visible, stood Maria Redhawk, looking exactly as she does today. The revelation sent me racing back to her house, but the building was abandoned, looking as if it had been empty for decades. The journal still sat where I'd last seen it, covered in dust except for a new page of fresh writing. 6 remain. The circle must be completed. The words seemed to writhe on the page, forming and reforming into different symbols. Outside, the Joshua trees had multiplied, forming concentric circles around the house. As I watched, more symbols began burning themselves into the ground, creating a complex pattern that spiraled outward from where I stood. That night, I witnessed something that shattered my remaining skepticism. From my vantage point on a hill overlooking the park, I saw them. 6 other people, each surrounded by their own circles of trees, each marked like me. We were being herded, I realized, drawn together by an unseen force. The trees moved more openly now, their roots pulling through the sand like tentacles, their branches reaching for each other across the darkened desert. The symbols beneath our feet pulsed in unison, creating a network of glowing lines that connected all 7 locations. Through the camera lens, I caught glimpses of Maria appearing and disappearing between the trees, but she wasn't alone. Other figures moved with her, their forms translucent and ancient, wearing ceremonial robes adorned with the same symbols that marked us. They were conducting some sort of ritual, their movements synchronized with the swaying of the trees and the pulsing of the symbols. The air itself seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble with a deep rhythmic vibration. I tried one last time to escape, driving at full speed toward the park boundary. The trees moved faster than should be possible, cutting off every route. In my rearview mirror, I saw the other marked ones making similar attempts. All of us trapped in this deadly dance. As my car finally died, its engine choked with sand, I understood the true horror of our situation. We weren't just random victims. We were keys, our markings part of a larger symbol that was slowly coming together. And as the trees closed in around me, their branches forming a living cage, I heard Maria's voice on the wind. The circle nears completion. The sleeper stirs. The final night descended on Joshua Tree National Park, like a heavy curtain, bringing with it an unnatural stillness. All 7 of us marked ones had been drawn to the center of the park, our individual circles of trees merging into a massive pattern that stretched across the desert floor. The symbols beneath our feet burned with an intense blue light, and the very air seemed to crackle with ancient energy. Through the gaps in the trees, I could see the others, strangers bound together by the same terrible fate. Each of us standing at a specific point within the larger design. Maria appeared in the center of our formation, but she was transformed. Her human appearance had melted away, revealing something far older, far less human. Her true form shifted between solid and transparent, like smoke caught in desert winds. Around her, the ghostly figures I'd glimpsed before materialized fully, the ancient Cahuilla priests who had made the original pact. Their voices rose in an otherworldly chant that made the ground tremble beneath our feet. The bargain must be renewed. Maria's voice echoed impossibly. The hunger must be fed. The sleeper must remain sleeping. But something was wrong. The symbols were changing. evolving into patterns that Maria and her spectral companions didn't expect. Their chants faltered as the ground began to crack, not with the anticipated ritual opening, but with something far more violent. I realized the terrible truth. After centuries of this cycle, the entity they'd tried to contain had learned, had adapted, had grown stronger. We weren't meant to be sacrifices to keep it sleeping. We were the keys to breaking its chains completely. The Joshua trees began their final dance, their branches weaving together above us to form a dome of living wood. The seven of us stood frozen, connected by lines of burning blue light. As the truth of our purpose became clear, each of us had been chosen for a specific reason. Our combined life forces creating a unique resonance that would shatter the ancient bonds. Maria and her priests tried to stop it, but their powers had waned over the centuries, while what lay beneath had only grown stronger. The desert floor shattered like glass, revealing not just the massive form we'd been led to expect, but a portal, a gateway to something beyond human comprehension. The trees weren't shepherds keeping us here. They were antennae, transmitting our energy to power this cosmic doorway. All the sacrifices over the centuries hadn't been feeding a sleeping entity. They'd been charging this portal, building up the energy needed for this moment. As the gateway began to open, reality itself seemed to bend and warp around us. In that final moment, I understood my role, not as victim but as witness. My camera, which had refused to capture the trees, suddenly worked perfectly, recording every impossible second. The other marked ones and I were not meant to die, but to serve as anchors. Human pylons keeping the portal stable, Maria's millennia-old deception crumbled as her true form was revealed. Not a guardian protecting humanity from an ancient horror, but a gatekeeper waiting for precisely the right combination of souls to open the way. The Joshua trees had never been trees at all, but the bars of a cage that was finally breaking. The portal reached full power, its energy surging through the human circuit we created. As the gateway between worlds stabilized, something began to emerge. Not a monster from below, but beings of pure light, imprisoned eons ago by those who feared their power. The Joshua trees transformed, their wooden forms dissolving into their true appearance. Crystalline structures that had been disguised as plants, ancient technology hidden in plain sight. The desert itself seemed to lift and shift, revealing the truth beneath the sand. Joshua Tree National Park had never been just a park. It was the site of the greatest quarantine in Earth's history, and we had just helped break it open. The dying autumn sun cast long shadows through the trees as I adjusted my backpack straps, watching Sarah consult her topographical map for the 100th time. Being a historian made her obsessive about details, but that's exactly why we'd wanted her on this advanced hiking expedition through Shenandoah National Park. What none of us could have known was how her expertise would soon become crucial to our survival. "I'm telling you guys," Mike said, pointing at the overgrown railway tracks we'd stumbled upon. "These aren't on any modern map. They shouldn't even be here." Our resident engineer wasn't one for dramatic statements, which made the tremor in his voice all the more unsettling. The rusted rails snaked through the dense forest like ancient serpents, disappearing into the growing darkness of the woods ahead. Lisa, our wilderness expert, knelt down to examine the tracks more closely, her experienced hands brushing away decades of accumulated leaves and debris. "According to the park's history, all railway operations here ceased in the 1950s, she muttered, more to herself than to us. "But these tracks, they're warm to the touch." The revelation sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. Despite the humid October air, that's when we heard it, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. The distant rhythmic chug of a steam engine, accompanied by the unmistakable screech of metal wheels on ancient tracks. Tom, our usually stoic photographer, nearly dropped his expensive camera. "That's impossible," he whispered. But we all knew what we were hearing. The sound was getting closer. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate, and the warm autumn air suddenly turned ice cold. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh with unexpected force. Through the gaps in the canopy, we could see thick black smoke rising above the tree line, moving steadily closer to our position. The smoke seemed to move against the wind, defying natural law as the source of the sound rounded the bend ahead of us, our collective breath caught in our throats. There it was, a massive steam locomotive, its black iron body gleaming as if fresh from the factory floor, steam hissing from its valves like an angry serpent. But what struck us most was the empty conductor's cabin, clearly visible in the fading daylight. The train was running itself, and as it thundered past us, I could have sworn I saw faces pressed against the passenger car windows. Faces that seemed to be decomposing before my eyes. None of us slept that first night. We made camp near the tracks, against our better judgment, but Sarah insisted we needed to document everything. The rhythmic clicking of Tom's camera provided little comfort as we huddled around the campfire, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. The locomotive had passed us 3 more times during the evening, each time heading in the same direction, defying all logic. Sarah's research on her tablet revealed disturbing information about the park's railway history. There were accidents, she explained, her face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. Lots of them, but one incident in particular stands out: the Tunnel 9 massacre of 1925. The name alone made my skin crawl, but what she read next turned my blood to ice. According to the records, an entire crew of railway workers had disappeared inside that tunnel, along with a full passenger train. The sound of distant whispers began to float through our camp around midnight. At first, we tried to dismiss them as wind through the trees, but they grew clearer with each passing hour. They spoke in an old dialect, discussing work schedules and track maintenance, as if echoing conversations from nearly a century ago. Lisa, usually the most rational among us, began recording the whispers on her phone, but when we played back the recordings, we heard only screams. Mike's engineering background couldn't explain what happened next. Our electronic equipment began to malfunction, but not in the usual way. The screens displayed old railway timetables from the 1920s, maintenance logs we'd never entered, and most disturbingly, lists of names, hundreds of them, all marked as terminated. The dates next to the names were all from 1925, except for 5 new entries at the bottom, dated for tomorrow around 3 a.m. We heard the train approaching again, but this time it was different. The sound came from all directions at once, as if we were surrounded by dozens of locomotives. The ground shook with such violence that our tent stakes pulled free from the earth. Through the chaos, Sarah pointed at something that made us all freeze. Spectral figures in period workmen's clothes, walking through our camp as if we weren't there. The apparitions carried tools and spoke to each other in those same whispered voices we'd been hearing, but their faces were wrong, twisted and malformed, as if they'd been pulled apart and hastily reassembled. One of them turned to look directly at me, and in its eyes, I saw the truth of what happened in Tunnel 9. The vision was so horrific that I blacked out, but not before I heard Sarah scream, "They're coming for us next," when consciousness returned. Tom was missing. Our campsite looked like it had been ransacked, but only his belongings were gone. As if he'd been specifically targeted, the morning sun did little to warm the unseasonable chill that had settled over the forest. Sarah was frantically cross-referencing her historical documents with a leather-bound journal we'd found among our scattered supplies. Its pages filled with frantic scribblings from 1925. The journal belonged to Dr. Edwin Matthews, the railway company's physician, and its contents were devastating. The Tunnel 9 incident wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The company had been conducting experiments, using the workers as unwitting test subjects in an attempt to bend the laws of physics and time itself. They'd succeeded, but at a horrific cost. The train we'd seen wasn't just haunted. It was trapped in a temporal loop, carrying its doomed passengers through an endless cycle of their final moments. Mike's engineering expertise finally proved useful in decoding the technical diagrams in Matthews's journal. The railway company had discovered a way to harness electromagnetic energy from the Earth itself, using the iron tracks as conductors. But their ambition had opened a door that should have remained closed, turning Tunnel 9 into a gateway between our world and something much darker. The workers hadn't just disappeared, they'd been transformed. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. Lisa's voice. We ran toward the sound, only to find her standing at the edge of a freshly exposed sinkhole. Below, partially uncovered by the recent rains, was a mass grave, dozens of bodies in antique workers' uniforms, their flesh impossibly preserved, all bearing the same grotesque mutations we'd seen on the spectral figures. Among them, still warm, was Tom's camera, its last photos showing something that defied explanation. Sarah's face went pale as she flipped through the camera's images. They showed the inside of the train from the night before, but it wasn't empty. The passengers were there, every single one of them, their bodies twisted and fused with the train's metal interior, still alive and aware after all these years. In the final photo, Tom had captured a figure standing behind him in the mirror, wearing a conductor's uniform. Its face was Lisa's. The familiar sound of the locomotive reached us once again, but this time it was accompanied by Tom's voice, calling for help from somewhere inside Tunnel 9. Lisa started walking toward the sound, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings when she turned to look at us one last time. Her face had already begun to change, metal and flesh merging in impossible ways. We had no choice but to follow her into the darkness, Mike, Sarah and I, knowing we were walking straight into the heart of a nightmare that had been waiting 99 years for new passengers. The entrance to Tunnel 9 loomed before us like the maw of some ancient beast. The air grew thicker with each step, filled with the acrid smell of hot metal and something else, something organic and wrong. Our flashlights revealed rails that seemed to pulse with a faint reddish glow, and walls that glistened with what looked disturbingly like living tissue. Every surface was covered in a complex network of patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. Sarah's research had prepared us for what we might find, but the reality was far worse. The tunnel had become a living organism, merged with the remains of those who had died here. The walls pulsed with a sickly rhythm, and in the deeper shadows, we could see movement, shapes that suggested human forms, but moved in ways that human bodies should not. The deeper we went, the more the boundary between metal, flesh, and stone seemed to blur. We found Lisa standing motionless before a massive chamber that shouldn't have existed. The tunnel had opened into a vast underground space filled with twisted machinery where the railway company's experiments had taken place. The air was thick with floating particles that looked like ash, but moved with purpose, each mote containing microscopic screaming faces. Mike's equipment went haywire, detecting energy readings that broke every known law of physics. The truth hit us all at once. The company hadn't just been experimenting with time travel. They'd been trying to create a hybrid of man and machine, a new form of consciousness that could exist outside of normal space-time. The train wasn't haunted. It was alive. A massive organism created from the fused consciousness of hundreds of victims. And it was still hungry, still seeking new components to add to its ever-growing collection of souls. Tom emerged from the shadows, but he wasn't Tom anymore. His body had been transformed. Flesh and clothing partially merged with the mechanical horror around us. Parts of his face had become transparent, revealing clockwork gears turning beneath his skin. They need more. He spoke in a voice that was both his and not his. The cycle must continue, the train must be fed. Behind him, we could see others, Lisa among them, their bodies in various stages of transformation. The walls began to move, revealing their true nature. What we had thought was ambient noise was actually the sound of thousands of voices, all crying out in eternal agony. The entire tunnel complex was one massive organism, and we were inside its digestive system. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with realization. She had discovered the pattern. The train appeared every 99 years to collect new victims, and we had arrived just in time for its centennial feast. The year 2024 marked the beginning of a new cycle, and we were meant to be its first course. Time had lost all meaning in the depths of Tunnel 9. Sarah, Mike, and I found ourselves running through corridors that defied Euclidean geometry, pursued by what remained of our friends. The living metal of the tunnel complex reached for us with tendrils of wire and flesh, trying to draw us into its endless mechanical nightmare. But Sarah had figured something out, something hidden in Dr. Matthews' journal that might be our only chance of survival. The locomotive's next arrival would be its last chance to complete the transformation. The experiment had been designed with a fatal flaw. If the cycle couldn't be completed with new victims every 99 years, the entire system would collapse. The company had unknowingly created a perpetual motion machine that required human souls as fuel, and we were determined to break its cycle. But the price of victory would be unimaginably high. Mike sacrificed himself to buy us time, using his engineering knowledge to sabotage the ancient machinery. As the metal tendrils pierced his body, he managed to reverse the power flow, causing feedback in the tunnel's electromagnetic field. The walls began to shudder, and the screaming of thousands of trapped souls rose to a deafening crescendo. But Sarah and I still had to reach the heart of it all. The last car of the phantom train, where the original experiment had gone so horribly wrong. We found it in a massive chamber, suspended in a web of writhing cables and pulsing organic matter. The last car was both beautiful and horrifying. Its elegant 1920s design, perverted by the abominations growing from it. Inside, we could see the original passengers, their bodies fused with the seats and walls, their consciousness trapped in an eternal moment of transformation. And there, in the center of it all, stood Dr. Matthews himself, or what was left of him. Sarah knew what had to be done. The journal had revealed that Matthews had installed a fail-safe, foreseeing that his experiment might go wrong, but activating it would come at a terrible cost. As the phantom train appeared one final time, thundering into the chamber with Tom and Lisa's twisted forms at its helm, Sarah pushed me toward the exit. "The cycle ends with me," she said, her eyes filled with a terrible determination. "Someone has to remain to complete the circle, to close the loop forever." I ran until my lungs burned, the tunnel collapsing behind me as Sarah activated the failsafe. The sound that followed was beyond description. The death cry of a 100-year-old abomination and the release of countless trapped souls. When I finally emerged into the sunlight, the entrance to Tunnel 9 had vanished, as if it had never existed. The cursed tracks had disappeared, leaving only undisturbed forest in their wake. But I know the truth of what happened there. And sometimes, on cold autumn nights, I still hear the phantom whistle of an approaching train. And in my dreams, I see Sarah's face among the passengers, finally at peace, having sacrificed herself to end a century of horror. I've been diving in Acadia National Park for over 15 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered that cold October morning. The Marine Research Facility had tasked me with documenting the unusual rock formations along the eastern coastline, where recent seismic activity had revealed previously unexplored underwater caverns. The water was colder than usual that day, and the visibility was surprisingly clear, almost unnaturally so, as if the ocean itself wanted me to witness what lay beneath. As I descended along the ancient granite walls, my depth gauge began to malfunction, displaying impossible readings that fluctuated between 20 and 2,000 feet. I initially dismissed it as equipment failure, but then my compass started spinning wildly, its needle rotating in patterns that defied any logical explanation. The rock face before me seemed to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but we were nearly 60 feet below the surface, where such phenomena shouldn't exist. My scientific mind struggled to rationalize what my eyes were witnessing, but there was no denying the anomaly forming in front of me. The first portal revealed itself as I approached a particularly dark crevice in the rock face. What should have been a simple geological formation instead appeared as a perfect oval of absolute darkness. Roughly 8 feet in diameter, my years of diving experience told me to retreat, to surface and report this finding to the facility, but something about the void called to me. The water around the portal was warmer, noticeably so, and small fish seemed to appear from nowhere, swimming out of the darkness as if emerging from another place entirely. My camera's memory card filled with footage that would later prove impossible to explain to my colleagues. The edges of the portal seemed to pulse with a bioluminescent glow, a soft blue light that reminded me of deep-sea creatures, yet we were nowhere near their typical habitat as I moved closer. My equipment began to fail one by one. First the backup depth gauge, then my diving watch, and finally the camera itself shut down completely. The only things still functioning were my breathing apparatus and the waterproof notebook I always carried. The local legends suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like warnings. The indigenous people had stories about doorways in the sea and paths between worlds, tales I had dismissed as mere mythology throughout my career. But as I hovered there, watching schools of unknown fish species emerge from what appeared to be solid rock, I realized that perhaps our ancestors had been trying to tell us something important, something we were too arrogant to hear, too scientific to believe. That first day, I made the decision that would change my life forever. I reached out toward the portal. The water around my hand began to vibrate, creating tiny cavitation bubbles that danced across my wetsuit as my fingers breached the darkness. I felt no resistance, only a strange sensation of weightlessness different from the usual feeling of being underwater. I withdrew my hand quickly, but not before noticing that my diving computer had recorded a brief temperature spike of over 90 degrees Fahrenheit in that exact spot. I knew I should report this immediately, but something told me that once I did, I would never be allowed to dive here again. So I made detailed notes, marked the location with GPS coordinates, and began planning my return. This time with specialized equipment to document whatever lay beyond that impossible void. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation and obsession. I requisitioned advanced scanning equipment from the facility under the pretense of studying thermal vents, knowing full well that I was about to use it for something far more extraordinary. My colleagues noticed my distracted behavior, the way I pored over old maritime charts and indigenous historical records, but they attributed it to typical researcher enthusiasm. If they only knew that I had found something that would rewrite our understanding of physics itself. The second dive almost didn't happen. That morning, I discovered my equipment had been tampered with, subtle changes that someone clearly didn't want me to notice. The oxygen mixture in my tanks had been altered, my depth gauges recalibrated to incorrect settings, and most disturbing of all, a note in my locker simply reading, "Some doors should stay closed." I checked the facility's security cameras, but the footage from the previous night was corrupted, showing only static during the hours in question. Despite every rational voice in my head screaming to stop, I gathered my backup gear and headed out to sea. Something was different about the portal when I returned. The bioluminescent glow had intensified, and the water surrounding it had developed a strange, viscous quality that reminded me of honey. As I approached, I noticed ancient markings carved into the rock face that I had somehow missed during my first visit. They appeared to be a form of writing, but unlike anything I had ever encountered in my studies, the symbols seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, as if they were alive and aware of being observed. My specialized equipment revealed readings that defied explanation. The thermal imaging showed temperature variations that created impossible patterns, like fractals extending infinitely inward. The sonar mapping system displayed depth readings that suggested the portal somehow continued through solid rock, reaching down to depths far greater than the ocean floor should allow. But most disturbing were the audio recordings. Beneath the normal sounds of the ocean, I could clearly hear what seemed like whispers in an unknown language. This time I was determined to do more than just observe. I had brought a specialized probe, tethered to my equipment by 100 feet of high-tensile cable. As I deployed it into the portal, the readings it sent back confirmed my wildest theories and worst fears. The probe reported atmospheric conditions consistent with both underwater and surface environments simultaneously, and the video feed showed a landscape that couldn't exist. Ancient structures that appeared to be both submerged and dry at the same time. Defying all known laws of physics, just as I was about to retract the probe, something grabbed the cable with enough force to nearly pull me into the portal. The tension meter spiked off the charts before the cable snapped, and in that split second, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. Something massive and ancient, With geometries that hurt my mind to look at, I kicked away from the portal as fast as I could, but not before my underwater microphones captured a sound that would haunt my dreams. A deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to resonate with something primitive in my brain, calling me back to the depths. As I ascended, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just announced my presence to something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to find it. After the incident with the probe, I knew I needed help. I reached out to Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine archaeologist who had studied similar anomalies off the coast of Japan. When I showed her my findings, she didn't dismiss them like I expected. Instead, she went pale and pulled out a journal from her personal archives. A detailed account from 1923 of an expedition that had encountered eerily similar phenomena in the same area. The expedition's leader had vanished mysteriously, leaving behind only cryptic warnings about those who swim between worlds. We organized another dive, this time with Sarah monitoring from the surface. As we descended to the portal's location, she guided me towards what appeared to be the remains of an underwater structure we had previously missed. The architecture was unlike anything ever documented. Massive stone blocks, fitted together with impossible precision, covered in the same shifting symbols I had seen before. But what struck me most was their age. Initial dating suggested they were at least 50,000 years old, predating all known human civilization. The discoveries came rapidly after that. We found what appeared to be a chamber carved into the rock face, its walls lined with crystalline formations that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Inside, we discovered artifacts that defied explanation, objects made of materials unknown to modern science, and sophisticated mechanical devices that showed no signs of corrosion despite millennia underwater. But most significant was a massive mural that seemed to tell a story about beings that came from the stars and shaped the very bedrock of our world. Sarah's surface monitors detected a massive energy spike as I photographed the mural. The water around me began to vibrate at a frequency that made my teeth ache, and the crystalline formations in the chamber started to emit a high-pitched tone that penetrated even the thick neoprene of my diving suit. The symbols on the wall began to move, rearranging themselves before my eyes into patterns that seemed to burn themselves into my mind. I later discovered that my camera had captured none of this, only static and distorted images that gave everyone who viewed them intense migraines. As I explored deeper into the chamber, I found something that changed everything. A perfectly preserved skeleton, but not of any known species. The proportions were all wrong, suggesting a being that could move in ways that violated our understanding of anatomy. Carbon dating would later reveal it to be over 100,000 years old. But the real shock came from the DNA analysis. The results showed that whatever this was, it shared certain genetic markers with modern humans, suggesting an intersection between their species and ours in the distant past. The final revelation of that dive came as I was preparing to ascend. My lights illuminated what appeared to be a map carved into the chamber's ceiling, showing a network of portals spanning not just Acadia, but the entire globe. They formed a pattern that matched ancient ley lines and sites of mysterious disappearances throughout history. But more disturbing was the realization that the map showed something else, a cyclic pattern of alignments. And according to my calculations, we were approaching the start of a new cycle. Whatever these portals were designed for, they were about to become active again. After millennia of dormancy, the facility had become noticeably more hostile to our research. Equipment went missing, data was corrupted, and anonymous warnings became more frequent and threatening. Sarah discovered that several other researchers who had investigated similar phenomena had disappeared without trace. But we were too close to the truth to stop now. The map we'd discovered suggested that during certain astronomical alignments, the portals would fully activate, creating a network of connections between points that violated our understanding of space and time. During our next dive, we witnessed something that shattered our remaining doubts. As we approached the original portal, we saw movement in the darkness, something massive and serpentine, with a geometry that seemed to shift and change as it moved. Our lights revealed segments of its body that appeared to phase in and out of existence, as if it existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The creature showed no interest in us, but its mere presence caused our equipment to malfunction and induced a state of primal terror that no amount of scientific rationalization could suppress. The water itself seemed to be changing, becoming thicker and more resistant to movement. Our instruments detected increasing levels of an unknown energy signature that matched patterns found in ancient astronomical records describing celestial events. The portal's bioluminescent glow had spread, creating networks of light that pulsed in synchronization with the massive creature's movements. We realized with growing horror that these patterns matched the neural activity of human brains in a deep, meditative state. As we documented these phenomena, we made contact with something that changed everything. A sound penetrated our minds, not through our ears, but directly into our consciousness. It was communication from something ancient and vast, something that had been waiting for beings capable of comprehending its message. The images it shared showed us the true purpose of the portals. They weren't just doorways through space, but windows into other dimensions of reality, created by beings who had evolved far beyond our understanding of existence. The truth about human evolution began to reveal itself through these communications. Our species had been shepherded, guided by these ancient beings through subtle manipulations of our development. The portals were part of a vast experiment, testing our readiness for something greater. Each disappearance throughout history had been a carefully selected individual, chosen to join a growing population of hybrid beings existing in a realm between dimensions. Sarah and I realized we had been chosen as the latest candidates for this transformation. The revelation nearly cost us our lives. As this knowledge was imparted to us, other entities began to emerge from the portal. Beings that defied description, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter we couldn't comprehend. They approached us with an air of clinical curiosity, their movements suggesting an intelligence far beyond our own. We managed to retreat, but not before one of them made physical contact with Sarah's diving suit. The material where it touched had been transformed into something else, something that continued to change and evolve long after we returned to the surface. The final piece of the puzzle came to us through dreams, synchronized nightmares that Sarah and I shared, filled with images of vast underwater cities and beings of living light. The genetic markers found in the ancient skeleton weren't evidence of past intersection with their species. They were proof of a carefully planned future. Humanity was meant to evolve into something far more profound than we had ever imagined. And the time for that transformation was approaching with terrifying speed. The facility had finally discovered the full scope of our research, and we arrived one morning to find our lab sealed and our data confiscated. But it wasn't corporate espionage or government interference. The order had come from something far older and more powerful. Hidden in the facility's original charter, dated 1892, we found references to an organization dedicated to protecting humanity from premature contact with these entities. They had been watching us all along, measuring our readiness for the truth. Our final dive was not a choice but a compulsion. The beings were calling us, drawing us back to the portal with a psychic gravity we couldn't resist. The water around Acadia had become strange, exhibiting properties that violated the laws of physics. Fish swam in impossible patterns, their bodies elongating and transforming as they passed through patches of altered space. The very fabric of reality seemed to be thinning, preparing for something momentous. As we approached the portal for the last time, we saw that it had grown, now large enough to swallow a submarine. The ancient symbols on the surrounding rocks were glowing with internal light, and the water itself seemed to be alive with swirling patterns of bioluminescence. The massive creature we had seen before was there again, but this time it was accompanied by others, each more impossible than the last. They formed a circle around the portal, their bodies creating geometric patterns that hurt our minds to look at. The transition began without warning. Our bodies started to change, not through any violent transformation, but through a subtle shifting of reality around us. We could feel our consciousness expanding, connecting with minds vast and ancient beyond comprehension. The truth of the portals, the ultimate purpose of their creation, became clear in that moment of transcendence. They weren't just gateways between places, but between states of being, chrysalises designed to nurture the next stage of conscious evolution. The choice presented to us was both simple and impossible. We could resist the transformation and return to the surface to live with the burden of knowing what awaited humanity, or we could surrender to it, becoming pioneers of human evolution. The beings showed us visions of both paths, one leading back to a world that would seem hollow and limited after what we had experienced, the other leading to realms of existence we could barely comprehend as the water around us began to crystallize into geometric patterns of pure energy, as our bodies started to resonate with frequencies that existed beyond normal space-time. Sarah and I made our final decision. The truth about Acadia's portals, about humanity's destiny, would have to wait for those who came after us. We had transcended the need for such earthly concerns, becoming part of something far greater than ourselves, the next chapter in the story of consciousness itself. I've always known there was something different about Redwood National Park at night, the way the ancient giants cast their shadows, how the fog seems to have a mind of its own, weaving between the massive trunks like a living entity. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered that cold October morning. As a ranger for 15 years, I thought I'd seen everything these woods had to offer. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The morning started like any other patrol. The crisp autumn air bit at my face as I made my way along the eastern trail, checking for any damage from the previous night's storm. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled my nostrils. A familiar comfort that would soon turn into something far more sinister. I remember checking my watch, 6:43 a.m., when I first noticed the strange markings on one of the oldest sequoias in my sector. At first, I thought it was vandalism. God knows we get enough of that from teenagers trying to immortalize their love with pocket knives. But these markings were different. They were deep, impossibly deep, as if carved by something with inhuman strength. The message was clear as day. They come when the fog rises. I've seen my share of creepy graffiti, but something about these words made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the precision of the cuts, or how the sap seemed to weep from the wounds like blood. I took photos, filed my report, and tried to forget about it. That's what protocol dictates. Document, report, move on. But when I returned the next day, everything changed. The message was different, but the carving style was identical. The darkness speaks their names. I checked my photos from the previous day, comparing them to what I was seeing now. There was no way someone could have recarved such deep markings overnight without anyone noticing. That's when I started keeping a log. Each morning, I'd arrive earlier and earlier, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was changing these messages. But it was always the same. New day, new message, same impossible depth. The words became more disturbing. They dance in the hollow trees. The ancient ones are hungry. Your time is measured in heartbeats. I knew I should have reported these changes to my supervisor. But something held me back. A voice in the back of my mind whispered that this was meant for me alone. By the end of that first week, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those carvings, their meanings twisting in my mind like serpents. The worst part wasn't the messages themselves. It was the growing certainty that they were responding to my thoughts. The morning after I first considered quitting my job, the message read, "No escape from the chosen path." I knew then that I was caught in something far bigger and more terrifying than I could imagine. The forest had chosen me for something, and I was beginning to realize that my badge and protocol wouldn't save me from what was coming. The deeper I dug into the park's history, the more my blood ran cold. Sitting in the dusty archive room of the ranger station, I discovered that every 27 years, there had been a spike in disappearances around my sector. The files were old, yellowed with age, but the pattern was undeniable. The most recent cluster had been in 1996. Exactly 27 years ago. My hands trembled as I realized what that meant. We were due for another cycle. Each case file told a similar story. Experienced hikers vanishing without a trace. Search parties finding nothing but empty camps and strange markings on the trees near their last known locations. The descriptions of these markings matched what I was seeing now, but no one had ever connected the dots, or if they had, they weren't around to tell the tale. The most disturbing part was how the disappeared people's personal belongings would surface months later, arranged in perfect circles around certain trees, the same trees that now bore these haunting messages. As I cross-referenced the dates and locations, another pattern emerged. Each disappearance had occurred during periods of unusual fog. When visibility dropped to near zero, the weather records showed these fog banks had appeared suddenly, defying meteorological predictions and dissipating just as mysteriously. The park's indigenous history suggested these were spirit fogs, times when the veil between worlds grew thin. I'd always dismissed such stories as local color meant to attract tourists. Now I wasn't so sure. The breakthrough came when I found a journal belonging to a ranger who'd worked here in the 1960s. His entries started normally enough, documenting daily patrols and wildlife sightings. But then he began describing the same phenomena I was experiencing. The changing messages, the oppressive feeling of being watched, the way the forest seemed to breathe at night. His final entry sent chills down my spine. They're not messages, they're a countdown. God help whoever is here when it reaches zero. That night as I drove home, my headlights caught something that made me slam on the brakes. There, on every tree lining the park's exit road, was the same message repeated over and over. Count the days. Ranger Sullivan. My name, my fucking name. The messages had never included names before. I sat there, engine idling, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold. They knew who I was. They'd always known. The question was, what did they want from me? I spent hours poring over maps of disappearance locations and finally saw what I'd been missing. When connected, the sites formed a perfect pentagram with my sector at its center. Ancient cultures believed such symbols could amplify mystical energies, but it was what lay at the pattern's center that truly terrified me. A grove of sequoias so old they predated written history. The locals called it the Whispering Grove, and according to legend, it was a place where the spirits of the forest would speak to those marked for their attention. Tomorrow, I would need to venture into that grove. The messages had made that clear. The circle awaits its final point. Dr. James Chen wasn't what I expected from a renowned historian of indigenous cultures. Meeting him in his cluttered university office, surrounded by artifacts and dusty tomes, he looked more like a surfer who'd accidentally wandered into academia. But the moment I mentioned the tree messages, his laid-back demeanor vanished. He slammed his office door shut and pulled out a leather-bound journal that looked ancient. "You're not the first," he said, "but you might be the last who can stop it." According to Chen, the sequoias in Redwood National Park weren't just trees. They were sentinels, placed there by an ancient tribe to guard something imprisoned deep within the forest. The messages weren't warnings or threats. They were a sophisticated alarm system, alerting those who could read them to weakening points in an ancient seal. The disappearances weren't random acts of violence. They were sacrifices, chosen by the trees themselves to reinforce the seal with their life energy. Every 27 years, when celestial alignments weakened the barrier, new sacrifices were required. The journal he showed me belonged to a Spanish missionary who'd lived among the tribe in the 1800s. It detailed a ritual gone wrong, an attempt by tribal elders to communicate with forest spirits that instead opened a doorway to something else, something that hungered for human consciousness. The tribe managed to trap the entity using powerful magic and the natural properties of the sequoias, but the price was high. They became bound to the forest. Their spirits merged with the trees, forced to stand eternal watch over their prisoner. "The messages you're seeing," Chen explained, his voice dropping to a whisper, "are written by the trapped souls of the tribe. They're trying to warn you, but they can only communicate through fragments and riddles because direct messages would draw the entity's attention." He paused, studying my face. "But you're different from the others who've seen the messages. You can understand them better. Can't you?" He was right. Somehow, I'd known all along that these weren't just random creepy phrases. They were pieces of a larger message, one that was becoming clearer with each passing day. The most chilling revelation came when Chen translated some of the older messages from the tribal language. They spoke of a chosen vessel who would appear when the stars aligned, someone whose blood carried traces of the original tribal bloodline. This person would have the power to either strengthen the seal forever or, if they chose wrongly, release what lay trapped within. With growing horror, I recalled my grandmother's stories about our distant Native American ancestry. Stories I'd never paid much attention to until now. The weight of this knowledge felt like a physical burden as I left Chen's office. In my hand, I clutched a copy of the original binding ritual. Just in case, he'd said, though we both knew it was more than that. On my drive back to the park, every tree seemed to watch my passage, their branches reaching like grasping fingers in the fading light. The message carved into the welcome sign had changed again. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. My blood, my destiny. The sun was setting and I knew that tonight, everything would change. The Whispering Grove lived up to its name. As I stepped between the ancient titans shortly before midnight, their branches creaked and swayed despite the absence of wind. The messages here were different, older, deeper, carved in patterns that seemed to shift. When viewed directly, my flashlight beam caught fragments of text in dozens of languages, some so ancient they'd been lost to time, but somehow I could understand them all. They spoke of doorways, of paths between worlds, of hunger that spanned millennia. The air grew thick with an unnatural fog that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Through its swirling tendrils, I watched in horror as the spaces between the trees began to change. It started subtly, a deepening of shadows, a twisting of perspective that made my eyes hurt. Then the first portal opened. There's no other word for what I saw. A tear in reality itself, edged with writhing darkness, through which I glimpsed things that no human was meant to see, vast landscapes of twisted flesh and bone, cities built from screams and skies that rained memories instead of water. More portals opened, each revealing new horrors. Through one, I saw the missing hikers from past cycles, eternally wandering through forests of glass and shadow, their faces frozen in expressions of endless terror. Another showed me glimpses of the original tribe, performing their fatal ritual, but from angles that shouldn't have been possible. As if time itself was bending around me, the fog grew thicker, and with it came whispers, thousands of voices speaking in unison, telling me of the hunger that waited beyond the veil, of the thin membrane that separated our world from chaos. My flashlight flickered and died, but I could still see. The trees were glowing now, their bark translucent, revealing the trapped souls within. They moved like dancers in slow motion, their features pressed against their wooden prisons as they tried to communicate. Their messages were no longer confined to carved text. They spoke directly into my mind, showing me visions of what would happen if the entity broke free. Cities would fall, reality would unravel. The very concept of existence would be consumed and reformed into something unspeakable. That's when I saw it. A shadow darker than darkness itself, moving between the portals, testing its bonds. It had no fixed shape, shifting between forms that made my sanity scream in protest. Sometimes it looked almost human, wearing faces I recognized from missing person reports. Other times it was utterly alien, a geometry of angles that shouldn't exist in our universe. It was aware of me, studying me with interest that felt like ice needles in my brain. I understood then why the sacrifices were necessary. This thing needed to be contained at any cost. In the center of the grove, the largest sequoia began to split open, revealing a passage that descended into the earth. The whispers reached a crescendo, urging me forward. This was the heart of it all. The central chamber where the original binding took place. The messages had been leading me here all along, preparing me for this moment. As I stepped toward the opening, the shadow entity's attention focused fully on me, and I felt its hunger like a physical force. It knew, as I did, that tonight would end with either its permanent imprisonment or its final liberation. The choice would be mine. But first, I had to understand the true price of either option. The descent into the heart of the sequoia felt like falling through time itself. The wooden walls of the passage were alive with moving images, memories of every sacrifice, every ritual, every moment leading to this night. I saw my own face repeated throughout history, wearing different bodies but always the same soul, drawn back to this place again and again. I wasn't just chosen. I was created for this purpose. My bloodline carefully preserved across generations for this exact moment in the central chamber. Reality bent in on itself. The space was impossibly vast, stretching far beyond what the physical dimensions of the tree should allow. Ancient totems lined the walls, each carved with the face of a previous sacrifice, their eyes following my movement. In the center stood an altar made from what appeared to be liquid darkness, constantly shifting and reforming. Above it, suspended in midair, was a crystalline structure that pulsed with raw power, the focal point of the original binding spell. The entity's presence filled the chamber like smoke, probing at my defenses, offering glimpses of terrible knowledge and infinite power. It showed me truths about the universe that no human was meant to comprehend. The illusory nature of time, the thin membrane between realities, the vast cosmic joke that was human consciousness. With each revelation, I felt my grip on sanity weakening, but also understood why the tribe had been tempted to communicate with it in the first place. The knowledge it offered was intoxicating, promising answers to questions humanity had asked since the dawn of time. That's when the true horror of the situation revealed itself. The entity hadn't been imprisoned by the tribe. It had allowed itself to be bound, using the ritual as a means to slowly corrupt and transform the forest over centuries. Each cycle of sacrifices hadn't strengthened the seal. They had been feeding it, allowing it to gradually extend its influence. The messages in the trees weren't warnings. They were its way of grooming its next victim, drawing them deeper into its web of manipulation. I wasn't here to prevent its release. I was the final key it needed to complete its transformation of our reality. With this realization came another, even more terrifying truth. I had a connection to this thing that went beyond blood or destiny. In every cycle, it had taken a piece of my soul, storing it within itself, ensuring I would be drawn back time after time. The faces I'd seen it wearing weren't just its victims. They were all me, fragments of my own existence scattered across time and space. It had been shaping me, molding me, creating the perfect vessel for its final emergence. The choice I thought I had was an illusion. I had been its creature all along, but in this moment of ultimate despair came an unexpected clarity. The tribe's failed ritual hadn't been a mistake. It had been a deliberate sacrifice, a complex trap, centuries in the making. They had known that the only way to truly destroy an entity of such power was to give it exactly what it wanted, to let it believe it had won, to allow it to pour itself fully into a prepared vessel. As this understanding flooded my consciousness, the crystal above the altar began to sing, resonating with the combined power of every soul the entity had ever consumed, including mine, all of mine. The time for choices was over. The real ritual, the one the tribe had set in motion so long ago, was finally ready to begin. And as the chamber erupted in blinding light, I embraced my true purpose, knowing that this end was also a beginning. The price of knowledge, after all, had always been transformation. I've spent my entire career searching for mysteries in ancient ruins, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered at Mesa Verde. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and what I'm about to share will challenge everything you believe about archaeology and the thin line between past and present. The first signs appeared 3 days after our arrival. I was reviewing my field notes in our camp when Dr. Rodriguez burst into my tent, his usually composed demeanor shattered by what he'd just witnessed. "The walls," he stammered, "they're different." At first I dismissed his concerns. These magnificent cliff dwellings had stood for over 800 years. Surely we were just seeing them in a different light. That night, I couldn't sleep. The desert wind carried whispers that seemed to echo from the canyon walls, a sound that reminded me of my grandmother's stories about spirits that walked between worlds. When dawn broke, I made my way to the Cliff Palace site. and my blood ran cold. The crumbling wall we documented yesterday stood perfectly restored, its ancient mortar fresh as if laid by invisible hands overnight. Our team gathered quickly, each member struggling to rationalize what we were seeing. The restored section matched the original construction perfectly, impossible without months of careful work. Yet here it stood, defying explanation. When we checked our cameras, they showed only static during the nighttime hours, as if something had deliberately obscured our surveillance. I ordered a thorough documentation of every inch of the site, hoping to establish a baseline for whatever phenomenon we were witnessing. But as we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The empty windows of the cliff dwellings seemed to follow our movements, and the air grew thick with an anticipation I couldn't explain. The local Pueblo liaison, James Running Bear, arrived that afternoon when he saw the restored wall. His face drained of color. He spoke only 4 words, but they chilled me to the bone. "They're coming back home." Before I could question him further, he turned and left, leaving us with more questions than answers and a growing sense that we'd stumbled upon something far beyond our understanding. The second night brought more than just reconstructed walls. I awoke to find strange symbols etched into the dust of my tent floor, intricate spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. When I tried to photograph them, my camera malfunctioned, and by sunrise, they had vanished without a trace. Dr. Rodriguez discovered similar markings near the restored wall, but these were different. They appeared to be carved into the ancient stone itself, yet our previous surveys had never recorded them. Carbon dating would later reveal something impossible. The carvings were simultaneously ancient and new, as if time itself was becoming fluid around the site. The atmosphere at camp grew tenser with each passing hour. Equipment began to malfunction in specific areas, forming perfect circles of dead zones where nothing electronic would work. We mapped these areas and found they aligned perfectly with astronomical positions significant to the ancient Pueblo people, a correlation that couldn't be coincidental. That evening, we heard drums echoing through the canyon. Not modern drums, but the deep, primal rhythms that seemed to emerge from the rock itself. Our audio equipment captured nothing, yet every member of our team heard it. The sound grew stronger as the sun set, and with it came a fog that shouldn't have been possible in the desert climate. I found myself drawn to one particular dwelling, higher up in the cliffs. As I approached, I could have sworn I saw movement inside. Shadows passing behind windows that had been empty for centuries. The logical part of my mind screamed for explanation, but the shadows moved with purpose, performing what looked like ancient ceremonial dances. When I finally gathered the courage to enter the dwelling, I found fresh cornmeal scattered on the floor, arranged in perfect ceremonial patterns. Next to it lay a single black and white bead, a type unique to the Pueblo people of the 13th century. When I picked it up, it was warm to the touch, as if it had just been worn. The discovery of the warm bead was just the beginning. That night, as we huddled in the research tent reviewing our findings, a strange wind picked up. It carried with it the scent of cooking fires and traditional herbs, smells that belonged to a time centuries past. The temperature dropped dramatically, and our breath began to fog in the unnaturally cold air. In the beam of our flashlights, we discovered more artifacts appearing out of nowhere. Perfectly preserved pottery shards, tools with fresh wooden handles, and most disturbingly, footprints in the dust that started from nowhere and led into solid walls. Each item we found dated from the same period, the exact time when the original inhabitants had mysteriously abandoned Mesa Verde. The excavation site began to change more dramatically. Not just walls now, but entire rooms reconstructed themselves night after night. More terrifying was the fact that these reconstructions began happening during daylight hours, forcing us to watch as stones lifted themselves into place and mortar appeared from thin air. Several team members quit, unable to handle the increasingly impossible events. Dr. Rodriguez made a breakthrough when he noticed a pattern in the reconstruction. The buildings weren't just repairing themselves. They were recreating specific moments in time. Using computer modeling, we determined that each night represented one day from 800 years ago. playing out in reverse chronological order. We were watching history unfold backwards. That's when James Running Bear returned, this time with 3 tribal elders. They performed a ceremony at the site, burning sacred herbs and chanting in their ancient language. As the smoke rose, it formed shapes that couldn't be natural. Figures dancing, hunting, living out their daily lives as they had centuries ago. The elders' faces showed recognition and fear. One elder, her voice shaking, finally revealed what they knew. The site wasn't just reconstructing itself. It was preparing. The Ancient Ones were returning, but not in the way we might think. They were coming back to correct a terrible mistake, to prevent a catastrophe that had forced them to abandon their homes. And somehow, we had triggered this spiritual awakening. I found the first journal fragment tucked into a newly reconstructed wall, pages that couldn't possibly exist, yet were undeniably authentic, written in ancient Pueblo pictographs. They told of a darkness that had risen from the depths of the earth, a force so malevolent that the entire civilization had been forced to flee. Sealing something away in their wake, the reconstructions had reached a fever pitch now. Entire sections of the cliff dwellings gleamed as if newly built, and at night we could hear voices speaking in long-dead languages. The most disturbing development was the appearance of shadows that moved independently of any light source, always gathering around a specific chamber that had yet to reconstruct itself. Using ground-penetrating radar, we discovered a chamber deep within the cliff face, one that didn't appear on any previous survey. As we prepared to investigate, the tribal elders warned us of an ancient prophecy. Every 8 centuries, the barrier between past and present would thin, offering a chance to alter history, but such changes would come at a terrible price. The journal fragments revealed more. The ancient Pueblo people hadn't simply abandoned their homes. They had sacrificed their entire civilization to contain something that had emerged from that hidden chamber. The reconstructions weren't random. They were recreating the exact conditions needed for another confrontation with this ancient evil. During our investigation of the hidden chamber, we discovered wall paintings that depicted a ritual, one designed to banish dark forces back to their realm, but the paintings showed something else. Figures that looked remarkably like our team members, painted centuries before our arrival. We weren't here by chance. We had been expected, chosen for this moment. The elders explained that the original Exodus had been a strategic retreat, not an abandonment. The Ancient Ones had foreseen our coming, known that future generations would be needed to complete what they had begun. The reconstruction of Mesa Verde wasn't just a supernatural occurrence. It was preparation for a battle that had been waiting 800 years to resume. As the sun set on what we knew would be our last night at Mesa Verde, the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The cliff dwellings now stood completely restored, every building exactly as it had been 8 centuries ago. The hidden chamber had begun to emit a low, pulsing hum that resonated through our bones. The tribal elders positioned us according to the ancient paintings, each team member standing on precisely marked points around the central plaza. Around us, the shadows had grown so dense they seemed solid, and through them we could see glimpses of another time. The Ancient Ones going about their lives as if past and present were overlapping. The chamber burst open as the moon reached its zenith, releasing what the ancient Pueblo people had fought so hard to contain. It was darkness given form, a writhing mass of shadow and malevolent intent that had been feeding on the boundary between worlds. Now it sought to break free completely, to bridge the gap between then and now. In that moment, everything became clear. The reconstructions, the artifacts, the mysterious events, all had been preparing us for this moment. As the entity emerged, we began the ritual exactly as the Ancient Ones had foreseen. Our modern equipment served as conduits for old magic, science, and spirituality, merging in ways I never thought possible. The battle was fought not with weapons, but with will and understanding as we completed the ritual. Time itself seemed to fold, bringing the ancient Pueblo warriors to our side. Together, across 8 centuries, we faced what they alone could not defeat. The entity fought viciously, showing us visions of our deepest fears. But the combined power of past and present proved stronger. In the end, the entity was not just banished but transformed. The darkness collapsed in on itself, and with it, the reconstructed buildings began to age rapidly, returning to their ruined state. But they were different now, not just remnants of the past, but monuments to a victory spanning centuries. As dawn broke, we found ourselves changed too. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde still hold their secrets, but now I understand that some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than explained. The Ancient Ones knew we would come, just as they knew we would succeed. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries in archaeology aren't the artifacts we find, but the truths we learn about ourselves. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness as I traced the limestone walls of Carlsbad's newest discovery. 20 years of spelunking had taught me to trust my instincts, and something about this cave felt different. The air carried a strange sweetness, almost like cotton candy at a county fair, triggering memories I'd long buried behind me. The rest of my team, Dr. Marcus Wong, Lisa Chen, and our young intern Tommy Parker, carefully documented every formation and crevice we encountered. The cave seemed to pulse with its own life, the walls almost breathing in rhythm with our movements. As we ventured deeper, the familiar musty scent of ancient rock gave way to something else entirely, the distinct smell of pine needles and sugar cookies. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized it immediately. Grandma Mitchell's kitchen during Christmas of '89. I shook my head, trying to clear the impossible thought. Caves don't smell like childhood memories. The passage widened into a chamber that stopped me dead in my tracks. My light illuminated what appeared to be a perfect replica of a child's bedroom. My bedroom, exactly as it had been 30 years ago. The pink wallpaper with carousel horses, the worn teddy bear sitting in the rocking chair, even the small chip in the windowsill where I'd dropped my father's hammer. Dr. Mitchell, Marcus's voice snapped me back to reality. What are we looking at? This is impossible, I whispered, my scientific mind racing to find a rational explanation. The chamber shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. Yet here it was, every detail exactly as I remembered it, down to the half-finished puzzle on the small wooden table. Lisa's equipment beeped frantically, registering readings that made no sense. The electromagnetic field was off the charts, and the air temperature fluctuated wildly. Tommy stepped forward, his face pale in the beam of his light. Dr. Mitchell, there's something you need to see. He pointed his lamp toward a narrow corridor branching off from the main chamber. The walls were covered in what appeared to be ancient petroglyphs, but unlike anything I'd ever encountered in my career, the figures seemed to move in the dancing light, depicting scenes of people being led into caves by shadowy creatures. Among the images, one symbol repeated, a spiral with an eye at its center. As we examined the mysterious artwork, a child's laugh echoed through the chamber. My laugh, from decades ago. The sound bounced off the walls, multiplying until it filled the space with a chorus of ghostly giggles. The temperature dropped suddenly, and our lights flickered in unison. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The teddy bear in the rocking chair had turned its head to watch us, its glass eyes reflecting our lights with an unnatural gleam. The discovery of my childhood bedroom was just the beginning. As we pressed deeper into the cave system, each team member encountered their own impossible spaces. Marcus stopped abruptly as we entered a chamber that perfectly recreated his father's garage in San Francisco, complete with the distinctive smell of motor oil and the old radio that only played static. His hands trembled as he touched the workbench where he'd spent countless hours learning to fix engines. Lisa's personal chamber manifested as her grandmother's garden in Taiwan, somehow thriving in the depths of the earth. Impossible flowers bloomed in the darkness, their petals luminescent and pulsing with an inner light. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, and we could hear the distant sound of her grandmother's wind chimes. When Lisa reached out to touch a flower, it dissolved into a shower of phosphorescent spores that swirled around us like fireflies. Tommy's reaction was the most disturbing. His chamber recreated a hospital room, and the moment he saw it, he collapsed to his knees, hyperventilating. "This isn't right," he gasped. "I've never told anyone about this place." The monitors in the phantom room beeped steadily. and a wheelchair sat empty in the corner. A small teddy bear with one missing eye perched on its seat. The rest of us couldn't see what else he saw, but whatever it was left him shaking and unable to speak for several minutes. The cave seemed to be feeding off our reactions, growing stronger with each emotional response. Our instruments were registering impossible energy readings, and the air itself felt charged with potential. The petroglyphs we'd discovered earlier began appearing throughout the system, always featuring that same spiral eye symbol. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, studied, our reactions catalogued by some unseen presence. As we documented each chamber, I noticed a pattern emerging in the cave's structure. The passages weren't random. They formed a spiral pattern leading inward, each personal space positioned like a bead on a string. When I mapped it out, my hands shaking as I drew, the layout exactly matched the spiral symbol from the petroglyphs. We weren't just discovering these spaces. We were being led through them deliberately. The true horror revealed itself when we tried to backtrack to get more equipment. The passages had shifted, rearranged themselves while we weren't looking. Our exit was gone, replaced by more tunnels leading deeper into the earth. The cave wasn't just showing us our memories, it was trapping us in them, drawing us further into its depths with the promise of answers about these impossible recreations. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, I could hear what sounded like my mother's voice calling my name, just as she had the day she disappeared 25 years ago. The revelation about my mother's voice sent me into a research frenzy. While the team rested, I pored over the cave's documentation on my tablet. Previous expeditions to Carlsbad had reported strange phenomena, missing persons, unexplained sounds, and most significantly, a pattern of disappearances every 27 years. The dates aligned perfectly with my mother's vanishing, and a cold realization settled in my gut. She might have encountered exactly what we were facing now. Our satellite phone managed to get a weak signal, and I contacted the Park Service for historical records. What they sent chilled me to the bone. In 1967, an entire research team disappeared in this section of the cave system. Their final radio transmission mentioned finding memories made real and a hunger in the dark. The rescue team found only their equipment, scattered around a chamber that each rescuer described differently. As if each person was seeing their own personal space, the deeper truth emerged when Lisa discovered a journal wedged into a crevice, its pages yellow with age. It belonged to Dr. James Harrison, the leader of the 1967 expedition. His final entries described an entity that fed on human memories, using them to create elaborate illusions to lure victims deeper into its lair. The more emotional attachment to a memory, the more powerful the lure. He called it the Nemophage, the memory eater. Marcus's analysis of our atmospheric readings revealed something unprecedented. The air in each chamber contained trace amounts of an unknown neurotransmitter, one that seemed to bridge the gap between thought and reality. The cave wasn't just showing us our memories, it was somehow extracting them directly from our minds and making them manifest. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Tommy's research into the petroglyphs yielded another breakthrough. The symbols weren't just decorative. They were warnings left by an ancient indigenous tribe. They told of a being that lived in the depths. Feeding on the essence of human consciousness, the spiral eye symbol wasn't just its mark. It was a map of its feeding ground, with each loop representing a layer of memories it had consumed. The tribe had sealed the cave centuries ago, but our expedition had unwittingly broken those seals. The most disturbing discovery came when we reviewed our camera footage. In each frame showing one of the memory chambers, dark figures could be seen lurking in the backgrounds. Shadowy observers that none of us had noticed in the moment. They seemed to be made of living darkness, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. But most terrifying of all, in every image of these entities, they were standing progressively closer to us, reaching out with elongated fingers toward our unseeing backs. The entity revealed itself gradually, like a nightmare seeping into reality. It began with whispers, fragments of conversations from our pasts, echoing through the tunnels in the voices of loved ones long gone. Then came the shadows, taking more solid form, wearing the faces of people we'd lost. The nemophage was done with subtle manipulation. It was ready to feed. We watched in horror as it emerged from the darkness. A writhing mass of memories given physical form. Faces we recognized bubbled up through its surface. Mouths open in silent screams. I saw my mother's features form and dissolve, alongside countless others who had vanished in these caves over the centuries. The entity had preserved every memory, every consciousness it had consumed, using them as bait to lure new victims. Tommy broke first when the thing approached wearing his dead sister's face. He ran toward it with arms outstretched. Lisa and Marcus managed to grab him, but not before the entity's tendrils brushed his forehead. The effect was immediate. Tommy's eyes went blank, and his most precious memories began playing out in the air around us like projected films. We watched his 5th birthday party, his first kiss, his sister's funeral, all while the creature absorbed these moments, leaving Tommy's mind increasingly empty. The horrifying truth about my mother's disappearance became clear as the entity shuffled through its collected memories. I saw her final moments, how she'd found this same cave system while studying the region's geology. The creature had drawn her in with memories of me as a baby, of her wedding day, of her own childhood. She'd fought it, documenting everything in her journal until the very end. The entity showed me where the journal was hidden, knowing the revelation would only make my memories more potent with emotion. While Lisa worked desperately to keep Tommy's consciousness intact, Marcus made the connection that would change everything. The cave's unusual mineral composition wasn't natural. It was a prison. The ancient tribe hadn't just warned about the entity, they had trapped it here, using the same crystalline structures that allowed it to manifest memories to contain its power. The spiral pattern wasn't its territory. It was a binding spell, weakened by centuries of the creature testing its bonds. As this realization hit, the entity launched its full assault. The cave filled with our memories, playing simultaneously in a cacophony of sight and sound. Every joy, every trauma, every moment that had shaped us was ripped from our minds and displayed. The creature's purpose became clear. It didn't just feed on memories. It sought to understand human consciousness itself. Each victim was an experiment, their memories consumed in its endless attempt to comprehend human existence. And now, with 4 fresh minds to examine, it would finally break free of its ancient prison. The final confrontation began with a revelation that shattered everything I thought I knew. As the nemophage continued its assault, I noticed something in the pattern of memories it displayed. Subtle discrepancies in my own recollections. The bedroom it had recreated wasn't just a perfect copy of my childhood room, it was the original. The creature hadn't been replicating our memories. It had been stealing them at the moment they were formed, collecting them like butterflies pinned to a board. Understanding bloomed like a poisonous flower. Every significant memory I carried had been experienced twice, once in reality and once in the creature's collection. It had been with us our entire lives, sampling our experiences, using the cave system as a vast antenna to reach into minds across the region. The disappearances every 27 years weren't feeding cycles. They were maintenance, necessary adjustments to keep its collection pure and potent. Marcus's scientific mind provided our salvation. The crystalline prison wasn't just containing the entity, it was amplifying its power. If we could disrupt the mineral structure, we might weaken it enough to escape, but the cost would be devastating. Destroying the crystals meant destroying the stored memories, potentially erasing not just our own recollections, but those of everyone the creature had ever touched. Hundreds of lives, thousands of memories, all hanging in the balance. The choice was made for us when Tommy began to seize, his mind unable to handle the strain of the entity's feeding. Lisa's readings showed his neural activity dropping rapidly. Soon there would be nothing left of him but an empty shell. My mother's final journal entry, now vivid in my mind thanks to the creature's display, provided the solution. The binding spell could be reversed, using the same emotional energy the entity fed upon to poison its food source. I began reciting the tribal chants written in the journal, my voice joining with the whispers of hundreds of past victims. Each syllable carried the weight of grief, of loss, of pain, all the darkest memories the creature had so greedily collected. The entity recoiled as the emotions it had sought for so long turned toxic in its grasp. The cave trembled, crystals shattering as centuries of stored consciousness fought for release. In the chaos of the cave's collapse, as memories exploded around us like fireworks, I saw my mother one last time, not as the entity's puppet, but as she truly was in her final moments, a scientist and a mother fighting to protect others from her fate. The cave sealed itself behind us as we fled, burying the entity in the very memories it had stolen. We emerged into the sunlight changed. Parts of our pasts were gone, fractured or transformed, but we carried with us the most important memory of all, the truth about what lurks in the depths of Carlsbad, waiting to feed on the memories of those who venture too deep into their own pasts. The relentless Utah sun had finally begun its descent when I first arrived at Arches National Park. My camera equipment weighing heavily on my shoulders, the golden hour was approaching, that magical time when light and shadow dance across the red sandstone formations, creating illusions that make even the most seasoned photographers question their eyes. I had built my career capturing nature's most enigmatic moments, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me in this desert sanctuary. 3 weeks ago, while browsing through an obscure photography forum, I stumbled upon a thread that would consume my every waking moment. The post contained a series of photographs taken at dusk, showing the park's iconic arches. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, but upon closer inspection, each image revealed something impossible. Dark, elongated figures passing through the stone arches, their forms translucent against the dying light. The thread disappeared within hours of my discovery, but not before I had downloaded every image, each one more disturbing than the last. The ranger at the entrance station barely glanced at my photography permit before waving me through. I couldn't shake the feeling that her eyes lingered a moment too long on my camera bag, as if she knew something I didn't. The parking lot near Devil's Garden was nearly empty. Most tourists had already left, seeking refuge from the approaching darkness in nearby Moab's comfortable hotels and restaurants. This was exactly what I wanted: solitude, silence, and the perfect light. Setting up my first shot near Landscape Arch, I meticulously checked my settings. The forum had specified certain conditions, all photographs showing the figures were taken precisely 17 minutes before sunset. When the light filtered through the arches at a specific angle, I had researched similar phenomena, convinced there must be a scientific explanation. Light refraction, dust particles, or perhaps some clever digital manipulation. Yet deep down, I knew this was different. The figures in those photos moved with purpose. As I waited for the perfect moment, I noticed something odd about my surroundings. The usual desert sounds, the whisper of wind through juniper branches, the distant call of ravens had fallen silent. The air grew thick with anticipation, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Through my viewfinder, the arch seemed to pulse with an inner light, its ancient sandstone surface appearing almost fluid in the fading daylight. I pressed the shutter release, and in that instant, my world changed forever. The preview screen showed something that made my blood run cold. In the fraction of a second captured by my camera, a dark figure stood perfectly framed within the arch. It was unmistakably humanoid, yet wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Its proportions were stretched, its edges blurred as if it existed between moments of time. But what truly terrified me was that it appeared to be looking directly at my lens. Despite having no discernible face, I quickly locked my eyes back on the arch. But there was nothing there, only the empty stone frame against the darkening sky. The next morning I convinced myself that exhaustion had played tricks with my mind. The image on my camera, however, told a different story. I spent hours analyzing it in my motel room, comparing it to the forum photos I'd saved. The similarity was undeniable. The same impossible proportions, the same suggestion of awareness in its posture. But mine was clearer, more defined, as if whatever I'd captured had wanted to be seen. When I returned to the park, I met James Morton, a veteran ranger whose weathered face suggested decades of service. He approached while I was setting up near Double Arch, his expression unreadable beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Photographing the arches?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew why I was there. When I mentioned the forum photographs, his entire demeanor shifted. He warned me about photographers who'd gone missing over the years, their equipment found perfectly intact near various arches. The conversation with Morton left me unsettled, but I couldn't stop now. I spent the afternoon scouting locations, marking GPS coordinates for each major arch. As sunset approached, I positioned myself near Turret Arch, determined to capture another image. The silence descended exactly 17 minutes before sunset. Just like before, this time, I was ready. Through my viewfinder, I watched as the air within the arch began to ripple like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. What emerged wasn't just one figure, but three. They moved in perfect synchronization, their elongated forms flowing through the arch like dark water. In a panic, I took shot after shot, the rapid-fire clicks of my shutter echoing off the ancient stone. When I lowered my camera, they were gone, but I could have sworn I heard whispers on the wind, voices speaking in a language that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Back in my motel room, reviewing the photos, I noticed something that made my hands shake. In each successive image, the figures were closer to my position, their featureless heads turned in my direction. In the final shot, one appeared to be reaching toward the camera, its arm impossibly long and distorted. But it was what I found in the background that truly chilled me. Dozens more figures, barely visible in the growing darkness, all emerging from different arches across the landscape. I tried calling Ranger Morton, but the park office said he'd retired 15 years ago. When I described him, the person on the phone went quiet before informing me that James Morton had disappeared in the park in 1989. His ranger hat found near Double Arch, the same spot where I'd met him earlier that day. The discovery about Morton sent me into a research frenzy. I spent the entire next day in Moab's small historical society, digging through dusty archives and microfiche records. What I found painted a disturbing pattern. Every 17 years, stretching back to the earliest settlement records, people had vanished in the park. Each disappearance occurred during the same 3-week period, always near sunset, always near the arches. The most recent cycle had begun exactly 17 days ago. Among the yellowed papers, I discovered a journal belonging to a 19th century surveyor. His final entries described doors opening in the stone and watchers who walk between worlds. But it was his hand-drawn map that caught my attention. He had marked several arches with strange symbols, creating a pattern I recognized from my own aerial photographs. The arches weren't randomly placed. They formed a massive geometric shape across the landscape, only visible when viewed from above. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the park as the sun began its descent. This time I set up multiple cameras, triggering them remotely from what I hoped was a safe distance. The silence fell right on schedule. But something was different. The temperature dropped rapidly, frost forming on my equipment despite the desert heat. Through my binoculars, I watched in horror as dark figures began emerging from every arch in sight. More than I'd ever seen before, they moved with newfound purpose, their fluid motions forming intricate patterns across the desert floor. I realized they were recreating the same geometric shape shown in the surveyor's map, but at a scale visible from the ground. As they moved, the air between the arches began to shimmer, like the surface of a soap bubble stretched across reality itself. The figures were doing something, performing some sort of ritual, and I was witnessing it. A gust of wind brought the voices again, stronger this time, and to my shock, I began to understand fragments of their whispered speech. They were counting, not numbers, but moments, measuring the space between seconds. Each arch, I realized, wasn't just a formation of stone. It was a marker of time, and these entities were its keepers. They maintained something ancient and vast, something that existed before humanity ever walked these lands. That's when I noticed my cameras had stopped working. Their batteries completely drained, but worse than that, the figures had stopped their dance. Every single one of them was now facing my direction, their elongated forms stark against the twilight sky, and in perfect synchronization, they began moving toward me, crossing the desert with impossible speed. their whispers rising to a deafening chorus. I ran, every instinct screamed at me to flee. But my feet carried me deeper into the park instead of toward the exit. The figures herded me, their formations shifting to block every escape route except the path they chose. As I ran, the world around me began to change. The sturdy rock beneath my feet felt increasingly insubstantial, as if reality itself was growing thin. The sunset seemed frozen, trapped in an endless moment of twilight that defied the normal passage of time. Near Delicate Arch, I found Ranger Morton again, but this time he was different. His form flickered like a bad television signal, switching between the man I'd met and something else. Something that had only been wearing his appearance like a borrowed coat. He spoke, his voice resonating with the same otherworldly quality as the whispers. "You've seen too much," he said, "but you've also seen exactly what you were meant to see. Every 17 years, we need a new watcher." The truth hit me with devastating clarity. The photographs on the forum hadn't been a discovery. They were bait. Every photographer who had vanished here had been chosen, drawn to this place by carefully planted evidence. We were being recruited, selected for our ability to see what others couldn't, to document what existed between moments of normal time. The arches weren't just natural formations, they were anchors holding something in place, preventing it from bleeding into our world. As if responding to this realization, the air around me began to crystallize. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. The figures converged, their forms melding together into a vast, dark mass that filled the horizon. Through gaps in their collective form, I caught glimpses of something else. Another world, one of crystalline geometries and impossible colors, where time moved like a liquid and space folded in on itself endlessly. Morton's form stabilized, but now I saw him as he truly was, one of them, merely better practiced at maintaining human shape. "The barriers between worlds are weakening," he explained. "The old ways of maintaining them are failing. We need new perspectives, new methods. We need human creativity, human intuition. We need photographers who can capture the moment when two realities touch, who can help us identify where the boundaries need strengthening." The mass of figures parted, revealing the arch I'd first photographed. But it was different now. The stone glowed with an inner light, and through its frame, I could see that other world clearly. My camera, still clutched in my trembling hands, began to hum with energy. The screen flickered to life, showing not what was in front of me, but what could be, an endless series of possible moments, each one a different version of the choice I now faced. The choice before me wasn't really a choice at all. It was an inevitability I'd been walking toward since I first saw those forum photographs. I understood now why they had chosen photographers. We already lived between moments, capturing fragments of time others never saw. We understood inherently that reality was more fluid than most people believed, that what we could see through our lenses existed in a space between what was and what could be. As I approached the glowing arch, my camera began capturing images on its own, each flash illuminating the truth of my surroundings. The figures weren't monsters or aliens, they were guardians, sentinels of an ancient system designed to keep multiple realities from collapsing into one another. The arches were pressure points, places where the boundaries needed constant adjustment and maintenance. Each watcher recruited over the centuries had added their own perspective, their own understanding of how to document and maintain these crucial boundaries. The barrier between worlds had grown dangerously thin. That's why they needed more watchers now than ever before. Through my viewfinder, I could see the cracks forming, reality splintering like stressed glass. Each photograph I took automatically seemed to stabilize these fractures, the very act of observation somehow strengthening the boundaries. This was what photography had always been meant for. Its true purpose hidden in plain sight since its invention. Morton and the other figures began to change, their forms shifting into something more comprehensible to my human mind. I saw photographers from different eras, some carrying daguerreotype cameras, others with modern digital equipment. They had all made the same choice I was about to make. They had all seen the necessity of their sacrifice. The vanished photographers hadn't been victims. They had become guardians, using their unique way of seeing the world to protect it. As I stepped through the arch, I felt my body begin to change. Time stretched around me like taffy, and I could suddenly see in all directions at once, past, present, and multiple possible futures. My camera melded with my consciousness, becoming less a tool and more an extension of my newfound awareness. I understood that I would still be able to move through the normal world, appearing as myself to take the photographs necessary to maintain the boundaries, but I would never again be purely human. Standing now between realities, I raise my camera one final time. The sun hasn't moved from its position 17 minutes before sunset, and it never will from my new perspective. I am both photographer and subject, observer and observed, existing in that perfect moment when light and shadow reveal the truth of all things. Through my lens, I watch as another photographer discovers some carefully placed photos on an obscure forum, and I prepare to guide them toward their own moment of revelation. After all, we always need more watchers, and I know exactly how to find them. I've been a guide at Mount Rainier for 15 years, and never once did the mountain make me doubt my sanity until that fateful expedition. The signs were there from the beginning, but like a fool I ignored them all. Maybe it was pride, or perhaps it was that inexplicable pull that kept drawing me back to the slopes. But I should have known better. The morning we began our ascent, the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the mountain itself was breathing down our necks. Our team seemed perfect on paper. Sarah Chen, a geologist with 3 successful Everest summits. Mike Thompson, a local photographer documenting ice cave formations. The Williams siblings, Emily and James, experienced climbers funding our expedition. And Dr. Marcus Reed, a meteorologist studying unusual weather patterns around the peak. I'd worked with various skilled teams before, but something about this group felt different, like we were hand-picked by some unseen force. The first oddity struck during our equipment check at base camp. Each piece of our gear had been meticulously laid out the night before, but that morning we found our instruments rearranged in perfect concentric circles. Sarah suggested someone was playing a prank, but the strange symbols traced in the frost covering our tent walls made my skin crawl. Nobody admitted to drawing them, and they vanished before I could photograph them. Our ascent began under unusually clear skies, with the mountain's peak standing stark against the blue horizon. The snow crunched beneath our boots with an almost musical quality, a crystalline sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. I'd never heard anything quite like it in all my years on the mountain. It was beautiful in a way that made you want to stop and listen forever, and that should have been my second warning. During our first rest stop, Emily mentioned hearing someone humming. We all dismissed it initially. Altitude can play tricks on your mind, and we were still adjusting to the elevation. But then James heard it too, a melancholic tune that seemed to drift up from the crevasses below. I assured them it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. The mountain never made sounds like that, not in all my years of guiding that night as we set up our first camp. The temperature dropped dramatically, the wind picked up, carrying with it what sounded like whispers. Fragments of conversations just below the threshold of comprehension. Dr. Reed's instruments went haywire, showing impossible readings that he couldn't explain. The geometric patterns of frost returned, this time spreading across our sleeping bags in intricate, impossible designs. None of us slept well that night, each lost in our own thoughts about what was happening on this mountain that had suddenly become so foreign to me. The second day brought with it a stillness that set my teeth on edge. The normal sounds of the mountain, the crunch of snow, the whistle of wind, the occasional crack of ice, had been replaced by an unnatural silence. It was as if the mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something. That's when we first heard it clearly, a haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the very ice beneath our feet. Sarah was the first to recognize that the music followed a pattern. As a hobby musician, she noticed that the notes formed a coherent sequence, not random sounds as we'd initially thought. She began humming along, matching the ethereal tune until Dr. Reed sharply told her to stop. There was something about the way she swayed to the rhythm that seemed wrong, almost trance-like. When Mike showed us the photos he'd taken of her during that moment, her eyes reflected the light in an impossible way, gleaming with an inner fire that shouldn't have been there. The Williams siblings started acting strangely after lunch. I caught them wandering off course several times, drawn to certain crevasses where the music seemed strongest. Each time I called them back, they appeared increasingly disoriented, insisting they'd heard their names being called from within the ice. What disturbed me most was that I'd started hearing it too. My own name, whispered in a voice that sounded disturbingly like my long-dead father's. Mid-afternoon brought us to an ice cave none of my maps had ever shown. The entrance was perfectly arched, its walls carved with symbols similar to those we'd seen in the frost, but these were clearly ancient. Dr. Reed's carbon dating equipment suggested they were over 10,000 years old, which was impossible given what we knew about human civilization in the region. More unsettling was how the symbols seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, forming new patterns that made my head spin. The cave seemed to amplify the music, transforming it into a full chorus of voices that made Mike's recording equipment emit nothing but static. The temperature inside remained a constant 45 degrees Fahrenheit, far warmer than it should have been at that altitude. Sarah insisted on collecting samples from the walls, but every time she chipped away at the ice, the musical notes changed pitch, as if the mountain was responding to her actions. The samples she collected would later reveal something that shattered everything we thought we knew about the mountain's geology. That evening we found an old journal wedged in a crevice near our camping spot. It was dated 1973 and belonged to another climbing expedition that had vanished without a trace. The final entry described exactly what we'd been experiencing. The music, the voices, the symbols, but it was the crude drawing on the last page that made my blood run cold. A perfect rendering of our current team, sketched decades before any of us had been born. With X's marked through 2 of the figures, the mist came without warning on our 3rd day, rolling up from below like a living thing. It wasn't the normal weather pattern I'd grown accustomed to over my years on Rainier. This fog had purpose. It moved against the wind, swirling in impossible patterns that defied physics through the thick white veil. The music grew stronger, more insistent, and for the first time, I could make out words in languages that no human throat should be able to produce. We lost Mike first. The fog had reduced visibility to mere feet, and we'd roped ourselves together as a precaution. One moment he was behind me, photographing what he claimed were shapes moving in the mist, and the next, his rope hung limply, cleanly cut despite being rated for thousands of pounds of tension. The scream we heard moments later wasn't one of terror or pain. It was ecstasy, as if he'd finally found something he'd spent his whole life searching for. We never found his body, but his camera was there on the snow, and the last photo on it showed all of us looking back at the lens. Even though we'd been facing forward when it was taken, Dr. Reed's scientific demeanor cracked as he analyzed the mist's composition. His instruments detected radiation patterns that shouldn't exist in nature, and the temperature within the fog varied wildly. Patches of Arctic cold interspersed with areas hot enough to instantly melt our crampons. He babbled about quantum superpositions and dimensional rifts, his words becoming increasingly frantic until Sarah noticed he'd started writing in those same ancient symbols we'd seen in the cave. Covering his notebook with prophecies of what was to come, the discovery of the temple changed everything. As the fog parted briefly, we found ourselves standing before massive doors carved into the mountain itself, covered in familiar symbols that now seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Sarah's geological equipment dated the structure to the last ice age, but the metal alloy making up the hinges was unlike anything modern science had catalogued. The Williams siblings began translating the symbols with impossible ease, speaking of ancient beings that had once walked these peaks and of sacrifices made to keep them sleeping. Emily disappeared next, but not before she finished translating the warning above the temple door. The words she spoke made James collapse in hysterical laughter. Through music they dream, through dreams they hunger, through hunger they wake. When we found her journal later, every page was filled with musical notes arranged in spiral patterns. The same melody we'd been hearing, transcribed in perfect detail. The dates on the entries went back years before our expedition, though she'd bought the journal new just for this climb. As the fog thickened around us, Dr. Reed made his revelation. He'd known about the mountain's true nature all along. His weather studies had been a cover for his real research into what he called thin places, where ancient entities reached into our world through sound and mist. His father had vanished on Rainier 30 years ago, part of the same expedition whose journal we'd found. The symbols, he explained, weren't warnings but instructions, a musical score for something that had been building to this moment for millennia. That's when we heard it. A deep resonance from within the mountain that made the temple doors begin to swing open. The temple doors opened into a vast underground city carved from ice and stone, illuminated by an otherworldly blue glow that seemed to pulse in time with the ever-present music. Massive columns stretched into darkness above, their surfaces covered in flowing symbols that moved like liquid mercury. The architecture defied explanation, geometric patterns that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that hurt to look at directly. This is where we learned the truth about all those who had vanished on Mount Rainier over the centuries. James's descent into madness was swift after finding the ancient records. The Williams family, it turned out, had a deeper connection to the mountain than any of us had suspected. Their ancestors had been guardians, part of a secret society dedicated to keeping the entities contained through ritual music. The siblings hadn't been drawn to our expedition by chance. They'd been called. Just as their bloodline had been called for generations, James could no longer fight the compulsion to join the haunting chorus that now filled every chamber of the underground city. Dr. Reed's instruments confirmed what we'd all begun to suspect. The entire mountain was one massive resonance chamber, designed to amplify the musical frequencies that kept the ancient beings in their dreamless sleep. The missing climbers throughout history hadn't died. They'd been absorbed into the mountain's eternal choir, their voices added to the song that prevented something unthinkable from awakening. The patterns in the frost, the whispered names, the mysterious music, all of it had been the mountain's way of selecting new singers. Sarah's geological samples revealed the horrifying truth about the mountain's composition. What we thought was ordinary rock and ice was actually organic material, crystallized and transformed over millennia. The entire peak was a living entity, growing and reshaping itself according to some unfathomable design. The symbols weren't just writing, they were neural patterns, thoughts of something so vast and alien that merely comprehending it threatened our sanity. Each drumming heartbeat of the mountain brought new revelations that stripped away another layer of what we thought we knew about reality. The central chamber held the answers we'd been seeking, though I wish to God we'd never found them. Suspended in columns of crystalline ice were the preserved forms of hundreds of climbers, their faces frozen in expressions of rapture. They weren't dead. Their bodies pulsed with that same blue light that illuminated the city, their vocal cords vibrating in perfect harmony with the mountain's song. Among them, I recognized faces from photographs of historical expeditions, including Dr. Reed's father, somehow unchanged after 30 years in the ice, as we stood there, surrounded by the living history of Mount Rainier's disappearances. James began translating the final set of symbols, the ones that crowned the central archway of the chamber. The truth they revealed about my own connection to this place, about why I'd felt drawn to the mountain all these years, why I'd been chosen to guide this particular group to this particular moment, was more terrible than anything I could have imagined. The mountain hadn't been calling us, it had been calling me, preparing me for a role I'd been groomed for since before my birth. The revelation hit me like an avalanche. I wasn't just another guide on Mount Rainier. I was the last descendant of the original composers, those who had first crafted the binding melody millennia ago. Every expedition I'd led, every life lost to the mountain song, had been preparation for this moment. The symbols James translated revealed that the ancient harmony was failing, and only a descendant of the original composers could reinforce it. My entire life, my career choice, my inexplicable connection to the mountain, none of it had been my own. Sarah was the first to notice the change in the music. The harmony that had maintained the sleeper's prison for thousands of years was becoming discordant. in the ice columns surrounding us. The preserved climbers began to twitch, their song taking on a desperate, pleading quality. Dr. Reed's instruments registered massive seismic disturbances throughout the mountain. The entities weren't just stirring in their sleep anymore. They were beginning to wake, and with them, something far worse buried deeper within the mountain's heart. The choice before me was impossible: join the eternal chorus and strengthen the binding song, or let the ancient ones wake and face whatever apocalyptic consequence would follow. James, now fully consumed by the mountain's influence, began the ritual chant that would bind me to the chorus. The sound that erupted from his throat wasn't human anymore. It was the direct voice of the mountain itself, speaking through him in harmonics that made reality ripple around us. Sarah and Dr. Reed collapsed, blood streaming from their ears as the sound reached frequencies beyond human tolerance. In that moment of clarity, I understood what no other climber had realized in all the mountain's history. The music wasn't containing the entities, it was feeding them. Every lost soul added to the chorus made them stronger, building toward a critical mass of harmonic energy that would finally enable their full awakening. The disappearances, the careful selection of musically and mathematically gifted victims throughout history, the very architecture of the mountain itself, all of it had been orchestrated for this moment, when they would have a composer's descendant to complete their symphony of awakening. Time seemed to freeze as I made my decision. With a desperate lunge, I reached for James's pack, where he kept the thermal charges we'd brought for avalanche control. The mountain song rose to a fever pitch as I began placing the charges on the crystalline columns. Sarah and Dr. Reed, fighting through their pain, understood my plan and began helping. The entities thrashed in their icy prison, their movements causing earthquakes that shook the entire chamber. We had moments, maybe less, before the harmonic convergence would reach its peak. The explosion that followed wasn't just physical. It shattered the harmonic prison that had contained the entities for millennia. But instead of releasing them, the destruction of their carefully constructed musical prison created a discordant chaos that tore them apart. The mountain screamed as its centuries-old plan collapsed, the sound of 1,000 voices crying out in rage and despair as the temple began collapsing around us. I saw James consumed by the very force he had served, his body dissolving into pure sound. Sarah, Dr. Reed, and I barely escaped as the ancient city collapsed behind us, burying the truth of Mount Rainier beneath tons of rock and ice. But on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, I still hear fragments of that eternal symphony. And I wonder if we truly ended it, or if the mountain is simply composing a new song, waiting for the next movement to begin.